"You're dead to me, Mother. I never want to see your pathetic face again," my son Daniel shouted as he stormed out of my living room, slamming the door so hard the family photos rattled on the wall. What he didn't know was that his cruel words would cost him the $3.2 million inheritance he'd been counting on for his luxury lifestyle startup. Money I would instead donate to the Grace Haven orphanage, where his arrogance would transform into life-changing opportunities for 37 children who understood the true value of family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Richardson, and at 70 years old, I've learned that sometimes the most painful decisions we make as parents become our greatest acts of love. I spent 3 decades building a small accounting firm in Hartford, Connecticut, watching it grow from a 2-person operation in my garage to a respected business with 40 employees and clients throughout New England. My late husband Thomas and I sacrificed vacations, drove used cars, and lived modestly so we could leave our 2 children, Daniel and his younger sister Sarah, a substantial inheritance that would secure their futures. The Richardsons take care of their own, Thomas used to say, a principle he inherited from his immigrant grandparents who arrived from Poland with nothing but determination. This wasn't just a saying in our family, it was demonstrated through decades of action. When Thomas's brother lost his job, we hired him at our firm despite the financial strain. When my mother needed care after her stroke, we converted our dining room into a bedroom rather than considering a nursing facility. When Sarah's college roommate became homeless, we opened our doors without hesitation. These weren't grand gestures, they were simply what family did for one another. Lessons I believed I had successfully passed on to my children through consistent modeling rather than mere words. Growing up in Hartford's modest Parkville neighborhood during the 1960s, I witnessed my own parents live these values daily. My father worked double shifts at the Pratt & Whitney aircraft plant, while my mother took in seamstery work from neighbors, not for personal gain, but to support extended family members struggling through difficult times. I remember waking at 5 in the morning to find my mother already bent over her Singer sewing machine, her fingers flying across fabric that would become communion dresses for families who couldn't afford store-bought ones. "Eleanor," she would tell me when I helped her with the hemming, "money comes and goes, but the connections we build through kindness last generations." She was right, of course. Many of those families she helped later became clients at my accounting firm, their loyalty spanning decades because they remembered who had shown up during their struggles. Thomas entered my life during my junior year, at the University of Connecticut, where I studied business administration as one of only 12 women in the program. He was completing his engineering degree, but what drew me to him wasn't his promising career prospects. It was watching him spend his weekends tutoring immigrant children in mathematics at the Hartford Public Library, refusing payment despite his own student loan burdens. Our courtship unfolded against the backdrop of shared values rather than romantic gestures. While other couples attended concerts and fancy restaurants, Thomas and I volunteered at the St. Vincent de Paul Soup Kitchen, painted houses for elderly neighbors, and organized fundraisers for families facing medical crises. When he proposed in 1974, he did so while we were serving Thanksgiving dinner at the homeless shelter. No dramatic gesture, just a quiet moment between ladling gravy that captured everything about who we were as people. We married the following spring in a ceremony that cost less than $1,000, choosing to donate what would have been reception expenses to the local food bank instead. Our wedding guests understood. They were the same community members who had witnessed our commitment to service throughout our courtship. The photographs from that day show faces of people we had helped and who had helped us, creating a tapestry of reciprocal support that would define our marriage for the next 38 years. Daniel arrived in 1977, followed by Sarah in 1980. From their earliest moments, we consciously integrated them into our family's culture of service. Daniel's first birthday party wasn't held at our home, but at the children's ward of Hartford Hospital, where we brought cake and balloons to young patients who couldn't celebrate with their own families. Sarah took her first steps at the annual church fundraiser, toddling between tables of donated goods while Thomas and I organized the sale. As our children grew, we involved them in every aspect of our community engagement. Saturday mornings meant Daniel helping Thomas repair bicycles donated to the church's Christmas toy drive, his small hands learning to true wheels and adjust brakes. Sarah spent afternoons with me delivering meals to homebound seniors, her cheerful chatter bringing smiles to faces that rarely saw visitors. These weren't chores or obligations. They were simply how the Richardson family spent time together. The accounting firm I established in 1983 grew from these same principles. When selecting our first office space, I chose a location in Hartford's struggling North End rather than the prestigious downtown financial district. The rent was cheaper, yes, but more importantly, I wanted to be accessible to small business owners and families who might feel intimidated by marble lobbies and brass nameplates. Richardson and Associates became known for taking on clients other firms deemed unprofitable. Immigrant entrepreneurs navigating their first tax seasons, single mothers trying to understand earned income credits, elderly residents confused by Medicare documentation. You're running a charity, not a business, competitors would tell me at Chamber of Commerce meetings. But they didn't understand that these clients, supported through their struggles, became our most loyal advocates. The bodega owner whose books we organized for free during his first year sent us every cousin and neighbor starting their own businesses. The seamstress whose tax troubles we resolved referred her entire church congregation. By treating people with dignity during their vulnerable moments, we built a practice that thrived on relationships rather than mere transactions. Thomas supported this approach wholeheartedly, even when it meant tighter family budgets during the firm's early years. He would come directly from his engineering job at United Technologies to help with the firm's overflow work, reviewing spreadsheets and filing systems late into the evening. Daniel and Sarah did their homework at the office conference table while we worked, absorbing lessons about dedication and sacrifice through observation rather than lecture. The children seemed to embrace these values throughout their youth. Daniel organized fundraising car washes for his soccer team's equipment needs. Sarah tutored younger students in reading at the library's after-school program. When their grandfather, Thomas's father, developed Alzheimer's, both children rearranged their schedules without complaint to help with his care, reading to him when words still had meaning and simply sitting with him when they didn't. But somewhere, during Daniel's college years at Yale, subtle shifts began appearing in his perspective. He chose economics as his major, which pleased us initially. Perhaps he would join the family firm, bringing fresh insights to our community-focused approach. But his coursework seemed to emphasize profit maximization over social responsibility, market efficiency over human connection. During holiday breaks, his conversation increasingly centered on internship opportunities at investment banks and consulting firms, rather than the community projects that had once engaged him. "You could do so much more with the firm, Mom," he would say, reviewing our financial statements with barely concealed frustration. "Your client base is holding you back. Why waste time on accounts that barely break even when corporate clients would pay triple for the same services?" I tried explaining that our success wasn't measured solely in profit margins, that the relationships we'd built over decades created value beyond financial statements. But Daniel's expressions suggested he found such sentiments quaint, relics of an outdated business philosophy that his Ivy League education had evolved beyond. Sarah, studying social work at Connecticut College, maintained the family perspective more naturally. She spent summers working at the firm, but unlike Daniel, she gravitated toward our pro bono cases, helping domestic violence survivors understand their financial rights, assisting elderly clients in navigating estate planning. The contrast between my children's approaches became increasingly apparent during family dinners that evolved from collaborative discussions into philosophical debates. "Charity is inefficient," Daniel declared during one particularly tense Thanksgiving meal in 2003. "Market-based solutions create sustainable change. Handouts just perpetuate dependency. Thomas attempted to bridge the growing divide. Both approaches have merit, he suggested diplomatically. But our family has always believed in direct action when we see need. Remember when Mrs. Patterson's house flooded? We didn't debate economic theory. We showed up with mops and buckets. Daniel's eye roll was subtle but unmistakable. That's exactly my point. One flooded house versus systemic infrastructure investment. Which creates lasting impact? Both have their place, Sarah interjected, trying to ease the tension. But when someone's standing in 2 feet of water, philosophy doesn't dry their carpets. These ideological differences might have remained manageable had life not intervened with brutal timing. In 2005, Thomas received his lung cancer diagnosis, stage 3, aggressive, with treatment options that carried more hope than certainty. The next 18 months transformed our family's abstract discussions about values into concrete tests of commitment. Sarah took a leave of absence from her graduate program to help coordinate Thomas's care. She researched treatment protocols, organized medication schedules, and accompanied him to chemotherapy sessions that left him weakened but determinedly optimistic. Daniel, by then working at a prestigious Manhattan investment firm, flew in for major appointments, but struggled to balance his career demands with family needs. "I can't just drop everything," he explained during one particularly difficult conversation. "This deal I'm working on, if it closes successfully, my bonus could cover Dad's entire treatment costs. Isn't that more valuable than sitting and waiting? Rooms." The logic was sound, but the absence was felt. Thomas never complained, but I saw how his eyes searched the doorway during treatments, hoping Daniel might surprise us with an unexpected visit. Sarah and I created elaborate fictions about Daniel's work obligations, protecting Thomas from the hurt of knowing his son prioritized conference calls over conversation during what we all recognized might be final months. When Thomas passed in, March 2007, the funeral arrangements revealed how deeply our family's fractures had developed. Daniel flew in the night before the service, having delayed his arrival to finish a crucial presentation. He stood at the podium delivering a eulogy that emphasized his father's professional achievements and financial prudence while barely mentioning the community connections that had defined Thomas's life. Sarah spoke next, her voice breaking as she recalled Thomas teaching neighborhood children to build birdhouses, his patience with her struggles in trigonometry, his quiet presence at every softball game and school play. The contrast between their remembrances created an uncomfortable tension among mourners who had known Thomas as both successful engineer and dedicated community servant. In the months following Thomas's death, I assumed grief would reunite our family around shared loss. Instead, the divide widened. Daniel approached Thomas's passing as primarily a financial event requiring efficient estate management. He arrived at our house with spreadsheets detailing asset valuations, investment, recommendations, and tax optimization strategies for the inheritance distribution. "We need to be smart about this," he insisted, spreading documents across the dining table where we'd shared countless family meals. Dad would want us to maximize the value of what he left behind. But Thomas had already been smart about it, in ways that reflected his values rather than mere monetary considerations. His will included numerous charitable bequests, scholarships for first-generation college students, funding for the hospital's cancer ward, support for the immigrant, assistance center where he'd volunteered. Daniel viewed these as unnecessary reductions to the family estate. "We could invest this money and generate returns that would fund even more charity over time," he argued. "It's basic financial logic." Sarah disagreed quietly but firmly. Dad specified these gifts because he knew these organizations needed immediate help. "It's not about maximizing returns. It's about honoring his intentions." The estate settlement created a permanent shift in our family dynamics. Daniel interpreted every charitable decision as a personal financial loss, calculating what his share would have been without the bequests. He began treating family gatherings as board meetings, arriving with agendas and departure times predetermined by flight schedules that minimized his time away from New York. Sarah, meanwhile, used her modest inheritance to establish a counseling practice focused on grief support for families facing loss. She purchased a small building in Hartford's Frog Hollow neighborhood, renovating it into a warm, welcoming space where ability to pay never determined access to services. I watched her transform her portion of Thomas's legacy into exactly what he would have wanted: a living memorial that served others daily. The firm continued operating through these transitions, though Daniel's absence from family operations became increasingly conspicuous. He had once shown interest in joining the practice, but his Wall Street career now consumed all attention. During his infrequent visits, he would review our financial statements with barely concealed disdain, suggesting optimizations that invariably involved dropping our least profitable but most vulnerable clients. "You're not running a charity, Mother," he would say, echoing the criticism I'd heard throughout my career. "At some point, you need to think about your own financial security." But my financial security had never been the point. The firm prospered precisely because we prioritized relationships over profit margins. Our client retention rate approached 90% over 3 decades, not because we were the cheapest or most sophisticated option, but because we treated people as humans rather than revenue sources during their most stressful financial moments. The breaking point in my relationship with Daniel emerged gradually through accumulated disappointments rather than single dramatic confrontation. He missed Sarah's wedding in 2012, claiming an unavoidable client meeting in Hong Kong. He skipped his cousin's funeral to attend a conference in Switzerland. He forgot my 70th birthday entirely, sending an expensive flower arrangement 3 days late with a card signed by his assistant. Each absence carried elaborate justification: critical deals, mandatory meetings, opportunities that couldn't be postponed. But the pattern revealed priorities more clearly than any direct conversation could have communicated. Daniel had evolved beyond viewing family as obligation to seeing it as optional, subordinate to professional advancement and personal ambition. Sarah tried mediating between us, suggesting family counseling or structured visits that might rebuild connections. But Daniel dismissed such efforts as emotional manipulation and guilt trips designed to extract time and money. His language about family became increasingly transactional, viewing relationships through cost-benefit analyses that reduced love to leverage and support to subsidy. The final confrontation began with what should have been happy news. In September 2023, I received a diagnosis that required immediate cardiac surgery, a valve replacement that carried serious risks at my age, but promised significant life extension if successful. When I called both children to share the news and discuss treatment options, their responses crystallized years of diverging values. Sarah immediately began rearranging her practice schedule, arranging coverage for her clients, while planning to stay with me through surgery and recovery. She researched surgeons, compiled questions for consultations, and created spreadsheets tracking medication interactions and post-operative care requirements. Her response embodied everything Thomas and I had tried to teach about showing up when family faced challenges. Daniel's reaction followed a painfully predictable pattern. He expressed appropriate concern, promised to figure something out regarding visit timing, then launched into detailed discussion about medical power of attorney, healthcare proxies, and the importance of updating estate planning documents before any major procedure. His focus on legal and financial implications overshadowed any genuine emotional engagement with my health crisis. "Have you considered the tax implications if something goes wrong?" he asked during what was supposed to be a supportive call. "We should really get the lawyers involved to ensure everything's structured properly." When I suggested that perhaps focusing on my survival might take precedence over estate optimization, his tone shifted to barely concealed irritation. "I'm trying to be practical, Mother. Someone needs to think about these things." Sarah coordinated the pre-surgical consultations, accompanying me to appointments while Daniel participated via conference call when his schedule permitted. His questions during these sessions focused exclusively on success rates, liability concerns, and insurance coverage rather than recovery support or post-operative care. The contrast between my children's approaches became so stark that even the medical staff noticed. One nurse pulling Sarah aside to compliment her dedication while conspicuously avoiding mention of her absent brother. The surgery date was scheduled for October 15th, a Monday that Daniel claimed conflicted with a critical merger announcement for one of his major clients. He promised to fly in as soon as the markets closed, which effectively meant arriving after the procedure's completion. Sarah took a full week off from her practice, arriving the Friday before surgery to help with preparations and remaining through the initial recovery period. The night before surgery, as Sarah helped me organize medications and prepare the house for my return, Daniel called with what he presented as generous compromise. "I've arranged for the best private nurse money can buy," he announced proudly. "She'll provide round-the-clock care so Sarah doesn't have to miss more work than necessary." Sarah's expression reflected my own emotional response to this suggestion, that professional service could substitute for family presence during life-threatening procedures. When I gently explained that I preferred family support to hired assistance, Daniel's frustration became evident even through the phone connection. "I'm offering to pay thousands of dollars for premium care," he said, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone whose generosity was being unreasonably rejected. "Most parents would appreciate that level of support." "Most parents would appreciate their children's presence," I responded, too tired for diplomatic deflection. "Money can't hold my hand in recovery or share memories during sleepless nights." The silence that followed carried years of accumulated disappointment before Daniel spoke again, his words careful but cold. "I've done everything possible to balance my obligations. If that's insufficient, perhaps we need to reassess our expectations of each other." The surgery proceeded successfully, with Sarah maintaining vigil throughout the 6-hour procedure while Daniel sent periodic text messages checking on status updates. My first coherent memory after anesthesia involved Sarah's tear-streaked face smiling down at me, her hand warm in mine as she whispered that everything had gone perfectly. Daniel's flowers arrived the next morning with a card congratulating me on successful risk management. Recovery required 2 weeks of intensive monitoring followed by months of cardiac rehabilitation. Sarah arranged her schedule to accompany me to every appointment, celebrating small victories like walking hospital corridors or climbing single flights of stairs. She transformed my recovery into something approaching adventure, creating elaborate charts, tracking progress, and organizing visits from friends who brought laughter along with casseroles. Daniel visited exactly once during the acute recovery phase, a precisely scheduled 36-hour trip that he spent primarily reviewing financial documents I was too medicated to comprehend fully. He seemed genuinely surprised that I preferred discussing grandchildren or garden plans rather than investment portfolio adjustments during my convalescence. "You need to think about the future," he insisted, spreading estate planning documents across my hospital tray table. "These medical events are wake-up calls about getting affairs in order." Sarah intervened gently but firmly. "Mom's future right now involves healing. The paperwork can wait until she's home and feeling stronger." Daniel's expression suggested profound disagreement with these priorities, but he gathered his documents with resignation that bordered on disgust. "I'm trying to protect everyone's interests," he muttered, "but apparently that makes me the villain." The tension that had simmered for years finally erupted 3 weeks after surgery, during what should have been a celebratory dinner marking my transition from walker to cane. Sarah had prepared my favorite meal, her grandmother's pot roast recipe, and invited several close friends to share the milestone. Daniel arrived late, phone pressed to his ear, concluding what sounded like a contentious business call as he entered. "Sorry," he said perfunctorily, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. Deal negotiations never respect personal schedules. The dinner proceeded pleasantly enough until discussion turned to holiday plans. Sarah suggested reviving our traditional Christmas Eve gathering, something we'd suspended during Thomas's illness and never resumed. The proposal sparked enthusiasm among the assembled friends, each offering to contribute dishes or decorations. Daniel's contribution to the conversation involved immediate practical objections. "That's significant expense for one evening," he calculated aloud. "The catering alone would run thousands, not to mention liability concerns with elderly guests in winter weather." "We're not hiring caterers," Sarah explained patiently. "Everyone. Bring something like we used to. Mrs. Patterson makes her pierogies, the Johnsons bring ham. I'll do Mom's sugar cookies. Potluck dinners?" Daniel's tone conveyed disbelief bordering on horror. "For Christmas Eve? What are we, college students?" The room fell silent as his words hung in the air, their dismissive tone invalidating decades of cherished tradition with casual contempt. Mrs. Patterson, whose pierogies had graced our holiday table for 30 years, carefully folded her napkin and studied her plate. Sarah's face flushed with suppressed anger while trying to maintain dinner party decorum. "These potluck dinners," I said quietly, "represent everything our family claims to value: community, connection, sharing what we have rather than displaying what we can afford." Daniel's laugh carried no warmth. "Claims to value? We're not politicians, Mother. This is just dinner, not some philosophical statement." "Everything is a philosophical statement," I continued, feeling years of accumulated frustration crystallizing into clarity. How we gather, who we include, what we prioritize, these choices reveal our actual values versus our professed ones. "Spare me the sociology lecture," Daniel snapped, his professional composure finally cracking. "Some of us live in the real world where success requires more than potluck dinners and feel-good charity work." Sarah attempted intervention. "Daniel, that's enough." But he was building momentum now, years of suppressed resentment emerging in sharp-edged words. "I'm tired of being judged for achieving success, for wanting more than this." He gestured broadly at our modest dining room. This performance of middle-class virtue that mistakes limited ambition for moral superiority. "Limited ambition?" I repeated, genuinely puzzled. "I built a successful firm, raised 2 children, supported countless community members through difficult times. How is that limited?" "Because you stopped there." Daniel's voice rose despite the guests' obvious discomfort. "You could have expanded nationwide, could have built real wealth, could have left a legacy worth inheriting instead of this. This archive of good intentions and small-thinking charity cases." The silence that followed felt different from previous awkward pauses. This carried finality, the sound of something irreparably breaking. Several guests quietly excused themselves, mumbling about early mornings and gratitude for lovely evenings cut short by family drama. Soon, only Sarah, Daniel, and I remained at the table littered with abandoned dessert plates and cooling coffee. "Is that really how you see our life?" I asked when the front door closed behind the last departing guest. "As small-thinking charity work?" Daniel's expression hardened rather than softening with the increased privacy. "I see wasted potential. I see a woman who could have built an empire but chose to remain a neighborhood accountant. I see an inheritance that should have been substantial reduced by endless charity that one ultimately accomplished nothing lasting." "Nothing lasting?" Sarah interjected, her usual mediating tone replaced by protective anger. "Mom's helped hundreds of families achieve financial stability. She's mentored dozens of young professionals who now run their own businesses. She's enabled dependency," Daniel interrupted. "Created expectation that someone will always rescue poor decision-makers from consequences. Real help means teaching people to succeed within systems, not protecting them from reality." I studied my son, this stranger wearing familiar features but expressing alien values, and wondered when the curious boy who had helped repair bicycles for needy children had transformed into this cold calculator of human worth. The physical resemblance to Thomas remained strong, but the spiritual connection to his father's principles had vanished entirely. The reality you reference, I said carefully, is one where people like Mrs. Patterson, who fled Poland with nothing, and built a bakery that employed 15 people, would have failed without initial help. Where families facing medical bankruptcy would have lost homes without intervention. Where children like your father, from immigrant families, would never have attended college without community support. Survivor bias, Daniel dismissed with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced genuine hardship. For every success story, there are dozens who took advantage of generosity without reciprocating. The market naturally selects for success. Interference just prolongs inevitable failures. The market selected for slavery once, Sarah noted with uncharacteristic sharpness. Child labor, company stores, workplace deaths. Sometimes interference is the only moral response to efficient cruelty. Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against hardwood floors with harsh finality. I don't need sermons from either of you about morality. I've succeeded beyond anything this family achieved through actual work, not sanctimonious charity games. Then why? I asked quietly. Do you care so deeply about inheritance from such small-thinking people? The question struck its intended target. Daniel's face transformed through rapid emotional progressions, surprise to anger to something approaching hatred. Because I earned it, he said finally. Because I endured years of judgment, of being made to feel guilty for ambition, of watching family resources disappear into bottomless charity instead of building actual wealth. You earned it? Sarah stood now too, facing her brother across the table. By missing Dad's treatments? By skipping my wedding? By appearing for exactly one day during Mom's heart surgery? By succeeding, despite this family's best efforts to keep everyone mediocre, Daniel shot back. By escaping the gravitational pull of small-town thinking and perpetual guilt about anyone doing better than subsistence level. If that's genuinely how you feel, I said, rising carefully with my still healing body, then perhaps you should complete that escape. Stop enduring our mediocrity and guilt. Live entirely in your success without the burden of family obligations you clearly resent. Daniel's laugh was bitter and short. Convenient philosophy when inheritance discussions approach. Push away the successful child, then claim moral high ground while keeping resources within your charity circle. There's nothing convenient about losing a son to greed, I replied, feeling tears I refused to shed in his presence. Nothing satisfying about watching values I thought we'd instilled dissolve into market worship and social Darwinism. Spare me the manipulation. Daniel moved toward the door, his body language radiating barely controlled fury. I see this clearly now. The emotional blackmail, the performance of virtue designed to extract compliance. You want children who remain dependent, who never exceed parental accomplishments, who mistake limitation for loyalty. Sarah stepped between us, her social worker training evident in de-escalation attempts. Everyone needs to calm down. We're family having a difficult conversation, not enemies. No. Daniel pushed past her toward the exit. We're not family. Family supports success, celebrates achievement, takes pride in advancement. This, he gestured broadly at our home, our life, our choices. This is a cult of mediocrity disguised as virtue, and I'm finally done pretending otherwise. He paused at the doorway, turning back with expression so cold it seemed to drop the room's temperature. You want to know what I really think? You wasted your life, Mother. Wasted Dad's life. Turned what could have been dynasty into a monument to small thinking and false virtue. And you're so invested in that narrative you'd rather lose a son than admit the truth. The truth, I responded, my voice steadier than my heart, is that I've loved you despite watching greed consume every value we tried to teach. But love doesn't require enabling someone who sees human worth only through net worth calculations. Daniel's final words came with quiet venom that cut deeper than shouting ever could. "You're dead to me. This whole suffocating, small-minded, charity-obsessed family is dead to me. I don't want your guilt, your judgment, or your pathetic inheritance. Keep it all. Wallow in your virtue while the real world moves beyond your comprehension." The door closed with controlled precision rather than dramatic slam, somehow making the departure feel more final than explosive exit might have suggested. Sarah and I stood in sudden silence, processing the verbal violence that had shredded. Decades of careful family construction in minutes of honest revelation. "He doesn't mean it," Sarah said finally, though her tone suggested uncertainty rather than conviction. "He's angry, hurt, feeling attacked. People say things." "He meant every word," I interrupted gently, "and has probably felt this way for years without expressing it directly. At least now we know where everyone stands." We cleared the table in companionable silence, washing dishes and storing leftovers with mechanical precision while processing the evening's transformation. The familiar domestic ritual provided comfort through routine, though both our minds clearly dwelt on Daniel's words rather than soapy water and leftover roast. Later, after Sarah had reluctantly departed for her own home with promises to check. In Tomorrow, I sat in Thomas's old study reviewing documents I'd been avoiding since his death. The will remained straightforward, equal distribution between both children after charitable bequests. But Daniel's declaration had fundamentally altered my perspective on inheritance, legacy, and the values we leave behind. I pulled out fresh legal pad, beginning lists that would eventually transform into new estate planning. If Daniel truly viewed our life's work as pathetic inheritance from small-minded people, perhaps those resources should flow toward recipients who would appreciate their actual value beyond mere monetary worth. The Grace Haven Orphanage came to mind, an organization Thomas and I had supported for decades, watching it transform from struggling shelter into comprehensive child development center. As hours passed and pages filled with revised plans, felt unexpected peace replacing anticipated grief. Daniel hadn't merely rejected inheritance, he'd rejected the entire value system it represented. His words, intended to wound, had instead clarified a decision I'd been unconsciously approaching for months. If family resources meant nothing beyond calculation of personal gain, then perhaps they belonged with those who understood their deeper purpose. The irony wasn't lost on me. Daniel's rejection of charity cases would ultimately fund the most significant charitable contribution our family had ever made. His declaration that I was dead to him would breathe new life into institutions serving vulnerable children who understood that real worth isn't measured in market valuations or inheritance portfolios. By dawn, my rough draft covered pages with detailed instructions that would transform Daniel's anticipated millions into endowments for education, housing, and healthcare at Grace Haven. The satisfaction I felt had nothing to do with revenge. This wasn't punishment for cruel words or absence during crises. Instead, it represented perfect alignment between resources and values, ensuring our family's legacy would serve those who understood that wealth means nothing without willingness to share it. The phone rang at 7, Sarah's worried voice checking on my emotional state after yesterday's confrontation. I assured her of my stability while avoiding mention of the night's planning session. Those details would emerge gradually, allowing her time to process her brother's rejection before learning about its financial implications. "Should I try talking to him?" she asked, her mediator instinct still seeking resolution despite the finality of Daniel's words. "No," I said firmly. He made his position clear. We need to respect his choice to separate from the family, just as he needs to accept the consequences of that decision. Those consequences would extend far beyond emotional distance, though Daniel wouldn't discover that until estate settlement eventually revealed how literally I'd interpreted his declaration. By removing himself from our family, declaring us dead to him, he'd forfeited any claim to resources accumulated through the very values he'd rejected so vehemently. The next few days passed quietly as I consulted with estate attorneys, refining plans that would redirect Daniel's expected inheritance toward Gracehaven's expansion. Each meeting strengthened my resolve, especially when lawyers questioned the wisdom of complete disinheritance. Their arguments echoed Daniel's own philosophy, prioritizing financial optimization over value alignment. He could contest this, one attorney warned. Courts sometimes overturn emotional disinheritance decisions, especially involving substantial sums. Let him try, I responded calmly. He'd have to argue that someone who declared me dead deserves inheritance from my estate. The irony might prove too much even for his practiced coldness. Word traveled through Hartford's close-knit professional community, though I'd requested discretion from all parties involved. Several business associates expressed surprise at my decision, while others shared their own stories of children whose values had diverged dramatically from family foundations. The conversations revealed how common yet undiscussed this phenomenon was. Successful parents watching children transform generational values into individual ambition. 2 weeks after Daniel's dramatic exit, I received formal notification that he'd removed me as emergency contact from all his accounts and documents. The clinical efficiency of severance, forms arriving via certified mail rather than personal communication, confirmed the sincerity of his declaration. He was systematically erasing our existence from his life just as thoroughly as I was redirecting his inheritance toward worthier recipients. Gracehaven's director, Patricia Williams, cried when I explained the planned bequest during our confidential meeting. "This will transform everything," she said, struggling to maintain professional composure. "We can expand the residential program, add educational support staff, create college funds for every child." Her litany of possibilities validated my decision more powerfully than any legal argument could have. Daniel's millions wouldn't purchase another yacht or fund another merger. They would provide homes, education, and hope for children who understood that family meant more than shared DNA or inheritance expectations. "I have one condition," I added as Patricia processed the magnitude of the gift. "Create a program specifically for children rejected by biological families. Call it the True Family Initiative, helping kids understand that real family is built through love and presence, not mere blood relation." She nodded immediately, understanding both the personal significance and practical importance of such programming. We see too many children abandoned by biological parents who prioritize their own interests. This funding will help them build chosen families based on mutual support, rather than genetic obligation. The documentation process proceeded methodically over subsequent months. Each meeting with attorneys, each signature on revised documents, felt like affirmation of values Daniel had dismissed as small-minded virtue signaling. The considerable fortune Thomas and I had accumulated through decades of ethical business practice would serve its intended purpose, supporting community rather than enabling individual excess. Sarah learned about the inheritance changes gradually, her initial surprise evolving into understanding as she processed her brother's complete rejection of family connection. "He made his choice," she said finally. "You're honoring that choice in the most appropriate way possible." Her own inheritance remained unchanged, though she'd already indicated plans to continue her parents' charitable traditions with whatever resources eventually came her way. The contrast between my children's values couldn't have been starker. One, viewing inheritance as earned right, the other as opportunity for continued service. As word inevitably reached Daniel through professional networks, I expected some response, perhaps anger at disinheritance or attempt at reconciliation motivated by financial loss. Instead, silence continued. His commitment to our mutual non-existence apparently transcended even millions of dollars in forfeited inheritance. In a peculiar way, I respected the consistency even while mourning the relationship it represented. The first Gracehaven expansion broke ground 6 months later, funded by advance distributions I'd authorized to accelerate the project. Watching children play in spaces created by Daniel's rejected inheritance provided complex satisfaction. Joy at resources well utilized tinged with sadness about their origin. Patricia had installed a small plaque in the new library, dedicated to families built through choice rather than chance, love rather than law. Local news coverage of the Grace Haven expansion carefully avoided mentioning the family drama underlying the donation, focusing instead on the positive community impact. But those who knew our story understood the deeper significance. How one son's rejection of family values had ultimately served to strengthen those same values within the broader community. Former clients and business associates approached me with renewed respect, understanding that my commitment to community support extended beyond business hours into fundamental life choices. Several shared their own struggles with children whose values had diverged from family foundations, finding comfort in knowing they weren't alone in facing such profound disconnection. "It's epidemic," observed Dr. Martinez, whose own daughter had cut contact after marrying into wealth that disdained her immigrant roots. Success somehow becomes justification for abandoning the very communities that enabled it. These conversations revealed a hidden population of parents mourning children lost not to death, but to values so alien they might as well represent different species. We formed an informal support group, meeting monthly to process grief that society didn't acknowledge. The loss of children who remained physically alive but spiritually unrecognizable. As my 71st birthday approached, Sarah organized a celebration that demonstrated everything Daniel had rejected about our family values. Instead of an expensive restaurant or exclusive venue, she arranged a potluck dinner at the Grace Haven Community Center, inviting everyone whose lives had intersected with our family's journey over the decades. The guest list read like a living history of our community connections. Mrs. Patterson arrived early with 3 types of pierogi and stories about her bakery's early days when Thomas had personally guaranteed her business loan. The Johnsons brought their famous honey-glazed ham and photographs from neighborhood barbecues spanning 40 years. Former clients who'd become friends filled tables with homemade dishes and memories of how Richardson and Associates had helped them through financial crises that might have destroyed dreams without compassionate intervention. Children from Grace Haven performed a song they'd rehearsed specifically for the occasion, their young voices filling the space with joy that transcended material circumstances. Several were residents of the new True Family wing, kids who understood abandonment firsthand, but were learning that chosen families often provided stronger bonds than biological accidents. "These children will benefit from your son's inheritance," Patricia whispered during the performance, uncertain whether mentioning Daniel would cause pain or satisfaction. "They're already benefiting," I replied, watching their faces shine with enthusiasm. "And they understand its true value far better than he ever did." The evening progressed through testimonials that would have embarrassed me in younger years, but now felt like validation of choices Daniel had dismissed as small-minded. A restaurant owner described how we'd helped him navigate bankruptcy during recession, enabling recovery that now employed 30 people. A teacher shared how our discreet assistance had helped her finish graduate school while caring for sick parents. A contractor explained how Thomas had taught him business principles that transformed handyman work into successful construction company. Each story reinforced the same theme, how presence during difficult moments created bonds that endured beyond transactional exchanges. These weren't charity cases or dependency relationships Daniel had imagined, but reciprocal connections that strengthened entire communities through mutual support. The people celebrating my birthday weren't beneficiaries of patronizing handouts, but partners in building networks of authentic human connection. Sarah's speech captured everything I felt but couldn't articulate. My mother taught me that inheritance isn't about money. It's about values transmitted through action rather than words. Every person here represents part of her true legacy. Not dollars in bank accounts, but lives touched, businesses saved, families supported through crisis. That's wealth that compounds through generations. As she spoke, I thought about Daniel, probably working late in his Manhattan office, surrounded by expensive furniture but profoundly alone in his rejection of everything this room represented. His inheritance, the millions he'd anticipated as birthright, now funded programs ensuring other children would never experience the abandonment he'd chosen to inflict. The birthday cake arrived not from a gourmet bakery, but from Grace Haven's teaching kitchen, where older residents learned culinary skills while preparing meals for younger children. Its imperfect frosting and slightly lopsided layers carried more love than any professional creation could have contained. As everyone sang, I felt Thomas's presence strongly, knowing he would have approved of both the celebration and the inheritance, decision it indirectly honored. Later that night, reviewing photographs Sarah had taken throughout the evening, I noticed a particular image that captured everything Daniel had forfeited. It showed me surrounded by children from Grace Haven, their faces turned upward with genuine affection, while my own expression radiated joy impossible to purchase or inherit. This was the family Daniel had rejected, not just biological relations, but entire communities built through decades of showing up when it mattered. The next morning brought unexpected communication from Daniel's former college roommate, Marcus, whom I'd remained friendly with despite their divergent paths. "I heard about what happened," he said carefully during our coffee meeting. "Daniel mentioned your estrangement, though his version differs significantly from what mutual acquaintances have shared." I remained silent, curious about how Daniel had framed our separation to others. Marcus continued with obvious discomfort. "He claims you cut him off for being too successful, that you're punishing him for escaping small-town limitations. But that doesn't align with the woman who helped pay my textbooks when my father lost his job junior year. People create narratives that justify their choices," I responded diplomatically. "Daniel needs to believe I rejected him rather than acknowledging his own words and actions." Marcus nodded slowly. "He's changed dramatically from college. Success hardened something that was always there, but balanced by other influences. Now it's just ambition without tempering compassion. I barely recognize him myself." This outside perspective validated my own observations while adding poignant detail. Daniel's transformation hadn't been sudden but gradual, values eroding through incremental choices until nothing remained of the curious boy who'd once helped repair bicycles for charity. Success hadn't corrupted him so much as revealed priorities that family influence had temporarily masked. "Does he know about the inheritance?" Marcus asked carefully. "I suspect he's heard through professional networks," I acknowledged. "Hartford's financial community isn't large enough to keep such decisions private." "Then he knows the amount?" "Over $3 million redirected to Grace Haven," I confirmed. "His share of what Thomas and I built through exactly the kind of community connections he now despises." Marcus whistled softly. "That's substantial. Most people would attempt reconciliation for far less." "Which proves it was never about money," I observed. "Daniel's pride exceeds even his greed. He'd rather maintain his narrative of rejection than acknowledge how his own words created these consequences." We parted with Marcus promising to remain neutral in the situation, though his sympathies clearly aligned with my perspective. These conversations with Daniel's former friends revealed how thoroughly he'd isolated himself, rejecting anyone who might challenge his worldview that equated worth with wealth accumulation. As seasons passed and Grace Haven's programs expanded through careful investment of Daniel's forfeited inheritance, I occasionally wondered if he'd eventually recognize what he'd lost. Not the money. He earned plenty through his Manhattan career, but the connections that created meaning beyond material success. The True Family Initiative had grown beyond initial expectations, providing not just housing, but comprehensive support for children abandoned by biological families. Their stories echoed Daniel's rejection with variations. Parents who chose addiction over affection, careers over caretaking, new relationships over existing responsibilities. But where Daniel had rejected family from position of privilege, these children faced abandonment without resources or options. "They're learning what family really means," Patricia reported during quarterly board meetings I now attended as major benefactor. "Not obligation based on genetics, but choice based on mutual support. Your son's rejection enabled their redemption. There's poetry in that transformation." Indeed there was, though the verse carried undertones of loss alongside celebration of purpose. Every child housed, educated, and loved through Daniel's redirected inheritance represented values he'd rejected but couldn't destroy. His millions had become exactly what he'd most despised: charity serving those he'd dismiss as life's failures rather than recognizing systematic disadvantages they'd overcome. 2 years after our confrontation, I received unexpected news through Sarah. Daniel had married. His bride, according to social media Sarah monitored, was daughter of a prominent investment banking family, whose values presumably aligned with his market-oriented worldview. The wedding, held at an exclusive Hamptons venue, had featured no family from his side beyond carefully curated business associates. "Should I send congratulations?" Sarah asked, her tone suggesting she already knew my answer. "He made clear we're dead to him," I reminded gently. "Respect his wishes by maintaining that separation. His new family represents chosen values just as Grace Haven represents ours." This matrimonial news reinforced the completeness of our estrangement. Daniel hadn't simply rejected his birth family. He'd replaced us entirely with relationships based on shared ambition rather than mutual support. His wedding photos, glimpsed through Sarah's computer screen, showed gatherings of expensively dressed strangers whose smiles seemed calculated rather than genuine. "I wonder if he's happy," Sarah mused, studying images of her brothers carefully. "Orchestrated celebration. He's achieved everything he values," I replied. "Whether that brings happiness depends on whether those values satisfy the human need for authentic connection." The philosophical question lingered unanswered, though subsequent news suggested Daniel's version of success provided limited fulfillment. Marcus occasionally shared updates. Daniel's marriage had produced no children, bad career timing. His wife spent most time traveling while he worked increasingly brutal hours. Their Manhattan penthouse featured in lifestyle magazines but hosted few actual gatherings, their social life consisting primarily of networking events rather than genuine friendships. Meanwhile, life within our real family, the community of mutual support Daniel had rejected, continued flourishing through exactly the connections he'd dismissed as small-minded. Sarah's counseling practice had expanded to include group therapy for families navigating estrangement, her personal experience with Daniel informing professional approach to similar situations. I continued working part-time at Richardson and Associates, having promoted long-term employees to leadership while maintaining involvement with clients who'd become friends across decades. The firm's culture remained unchanged, despite industry pressure toward impersonal efficiency. We still took cases others rejected, still prioritized relationships over profit margins, still measured success through client stability rather than revenue maximization. Grace Haven had used Daniel's inheritance to establish satellite locations throughout Connecticut, each implementing the True Family Initiative's approach to building chosen families for abandoned children. The program had attracted national attention, with other organizations seeking to replicate its success in creating lasting bonds among youth failed by biological relations. During one site visit to the newest Grace Haven facility, I encountered a teenager whose story particularly resonated. Marcus, coincidentally sharing name with Daniel's former roommate, had been abandoned by parents who'd prioritized international careers over child-rearing, leaving him with elderly grandparents, who'd eventually required care themselves. His intelligence and ambition reminded me painfully of Daniel at that age, but tempered by awareness of how easily success could corrupt values. "Why did you create the True Family program?" he asked during our conversation in the facility's library. A space funded entirely by Daniel's redirected inheritance. I considered various responses before settling on simple truth. My son chose ambition over family. His inheritance now ensures other children understand that real families are built through presence and support, not mere biological connection or financial provision. Marcus absorbed this quietly before responding. My parents said I was limiting their potential by needing care, that their work was too important for parental obligations. And now? Now I understand that choosing to show up is what makes someone family. These people, he gestured towards staff and fellow residents, they're here every day. That matters more than DNA or money. This young man's clarity at 16 exceeded what my own son had achieved at 40. Perhaps tragedy taught lessons. That privilege obscured, or maybe some people possessed innate understanding of human value beyond market calculations. Either way, conversations like these validated every decision following Daniel's rejection. As my 73rd birthday approached, I felt profound peace about the path our family had taken despite its painful fracture. Daniel's rejection had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened our values, his forfeited inheritance serving purposes he'd never comprehend from his isolation within Manhattan's financial towers. Sarah suggested another community celebration at Grace Haven, but I requested something quieter, dinner with her family and a few close friends who'd weathered the storm of Daniel's departure. We gathered at my home, sharing the meal around the same table where confrontation had exploded years earlier. The space held no negative energy now, having hosted countless gatherings that reinforced bonds Daniel had severed. Any regrets? Sarah asked later while we cleaned dishes together, a ritual that connected us to generations of women who'd found comfort in shared domestic tasks. About Daniel? I considered carefully. I regret that he chose values incompatible with authentic happiness, but I don't regret honoring those choices through inheritance decisions that reflect his stated priorities. He's never attempted contact? Never. His commitment to our mutual non-existence remains absolute. Sarah dried plates thoughtfully before speaking again. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you'd kept his inheritance intact despite everything. He'd have received millions that meant nothing beyond personal accumulation, I replied. Instead, those resources serve children who understand their true value. That transformation from greed to grace represents the most meaningful legacy possible. We finished cleaning in comfortable silence, both understanding that some fractures couldn't be repaired, only repurposed into something constructive. Daniel's rejection of family had become Grace Haven's foundation, his abandoned inheritance creating chosen families for children who'd experienced similar abandonment without his resources or options. The final legal documents transferring Daniel's complete inheritance to Grace Haven had been signed months earlier, but I'd kept one copy in Thomas's old desk, not from uncertainty, but as reminder of how profound rejection could catalyze equally profound generosity. The papers represented more than financial transfer. They documented transformation of loss into opportunity, of abandonment into community, of individual greed into collective grace. Occasionally, late at night in the study where Thomas and I had planned our life together, I'd wonder about paths not taken. What if I'd been the kind of mother who prioritized wealth accumulation over community service? Would Daniel have remained connected to family that shared his values? But such speculation proved pointless. I could no more have chosen pure ambition than Daniel could apparently choose authentic compassion. We were who we were, and his inheritance had ultimately served those who needed it most, rather than someone who'd valued it least. The orphanage called one afternoon with special request. Would I speak at their annual fundraising gala about the True Family Initiative's origins? I agreed reluctantly, uncomfortable with public speaking, but recognizing the platform's importance for sharing our story's deeper message about chosen families and transformed legacies. Standing before an audience of donors and supporters, I found unexpected strength in vulnerability. My son told me I was dead to him because I valued community over accumulation, I began, watching faces shift from polite attention to genuine engagement. His words meant to wound instead, freed resources that now serve children who understand what family really means. The speech continued through our history. Thomas's immigrants' grandparents establishing mutual support networks, our own choices to prioritize presence over profit, Daniel's gradual transformation from engaged child to isolated adult. I neither demonized nor excused him, simply presented facts that illustrated how values diverge even within loving families. His inheritance now houses, educates, and nurtures children whose biological families failed them, I concluded. They're learning what my son forgot, that showing up matters more than showing off, that presence beats presence, that chosen families often provide stronger bonds than genetic accidents. The standing ovation felt excessive for simply sharing truth, but Patricia later explained its impact. Donors usually hear about tax benefits and naming opportunities. You showed them transformation, how rejection becomes redemption when resources align with values. That's why they're writing checks with extra zeros tonight. Indeed, the gala raised unprecedented funds, with several major donors specifically requesting their contributions support the True Family Initiative. One elderly woman approached me afterward, with tears streaming down her weathered face. My grandson hasn't spoken to me in 5 years, she confided. Thinks I'm foolish for supporting refugee resettlement instead of leaving everything to him. Your story gives me courage to redirect my estate toward causes that actually value human dignity. These connections, strangers finding strength through shared experiences of familial rejection, created unexpected community among those whose children had chosen material ambition over meaningful relationships. We formed informal network, meeting quarterly to process grief while planning how our resources could serve those who appreciated their deeper purpose. As months passed and Grace Haven's impact expanded through Daniel's transformed inheritance, I occasionally received updates about his life through Hartford's interconnected professional networks. His investment firm had promoted him to senior partner, an achievement that would have brought me joy in earlier years, but now seemed hollow given its personal cost. His wife had filed for separation, apparently finding their marriage as transactional, as the values that created it. He worked longer hours than ever, accumulating wealth that brought neither satisfaction nor genuine connection. He's becoming what he always accused us of being, Sarah observed, after hearing latest updates through mutual acquaintances. Isolated, rigid, convinced his worldview represents only valid perspective. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Daniel had rejected family for limiting his ambition, yet his chosen path had created far narrower existence than our community-centered approach ever could. While we celebrated birthdays with potluck dinners surrounded by chosen family, he apparently ate takeout alone in his office, too busy accumulating wealth to enjoy its theoretical benefits. Grace Haven announced plans to establish scholarship program for their residents, funded through investment returns from Daniel's inheritance. The Elizabeth Richardson True Family Scholarships would provide full college funding for youth who'd built meaningful relationships within their chosen families, demonstrating through action rather than words their understanding of authentic human connection. "We're naming them after you," I protested when Patricia revealed the plan. "The board insisted," she explained. "Your sacrifice, and yes, losing a son to greed is sacrifice regardless of his choices, makes this possible. These scholarships will ensure our kids can pursue education without abandoning values that brought them together." The scholarship announcement generated significant media attention, though reporters carefully avoided mentioning Daniel by name when covering the story. Still, Hartford's professional community understood the connection, adding another layer to our family's complex legacy. My son's rejection had become public knowledge not through vindictive disclosure, but through the positive impact his forfeited inheritance created. Former clients occasionally asked about Daniel, their careful tone, suggesting awareness of our estrangement without knowing specific details. I developed standard response that acknowledged reality without inviting further inquiry. He's pursuing his path in Manhattan. We've chosen different values, but I wish him well. This diplomatic framework satisfied social expectations while maintaining boundaries Daniel had established through his dramatic declaration. Wishing him well wasn't mere politeness. Despite everything, I genuinely hoped he'd eventually find fulfillment beyond material accumulation. But that journey was his to make, just as redirecting his inheritance toward worthy purposes had been mine. Time softened the sharp edges of loss without eliminating its fundamental reality. I stopped expecting reconciliation, stopped checking for indirect communication through mutual connections, stopped wondering if major life events might prompt reconsideration of his absolute rejection. Daniel had made his choice with characteristic decisiveness. I was dead to him, and death, even metaphorical, rarely permits resurrection. Instead, I focused on the living, on Sarah's flourishing family, on Grace Haven's expanding programs, on the community of authentic relationships that comprised my real inheritance. The money Daniel had forfeited mattered less than the values it now served, transforming individual greed into collective benefit through careful stewardship aligned with principles he'd rejected. Standing in Grace Haven's newest dormitory, building funded entirely through Daniel's redirected inheritance, I watched children who'd experienced profound abandonment create genuine bonds through shared activities and mutual support. Their laughter echoed through hallways designed to foster connection rather than isolation, their enthusiasm for simple pleasures contrasting sharply with the jaded ambition that had cost my son his family. "You gave us more than money," Marcus, the teenager I'd connected with earlier, said during the building dedication. "You showed us that rejection can become gift when transformed through generosity. Every kid here knows your story, how your son's cruelty became our opportunity. That's more valuable than any inheritance." His words, delivered with adolescent earnestness that reminded me painfully of Daniel at that age, captured the essential transformation our family's fracture had produced. Loss had become gain, rejection had become acceptance, individual greed had become communal grace. The inheritance Daniel had viewed as birthright had birthed something far more valuable, a program ensuring abandoned children would never experience the isolation his choices had created. The dedication ceremony concluded with children performing songs they'd composed about chosen families and second chances. Their voices, imperfect but authentic, filled the space with joy that no amount of money could purchase. As I listened, I felt Thomas's presence strongly, knowing he would have approved not just of the financial decisions, but of the values they represented. That evening, reviewing photographs from the dedication, I found one that captured everything. Our journey had taught about inheritance and legacy. It showed me surrounded by Grace Haven children, their faces reflecting genuine affection, while my own expression radiated fulfillment impossible to achieve through material accumulation alone. This was wealth Daniel would never understand, the compound interest of human connection, the dividends of compassion, the appreciated value of presence over presence. Sarah called later, having attended the dedication despite her own busy schedule. "Any regrets about the inheritance decision seeing all those happy kids?" "Only that it took Daniel's cruelty to create such beauty," I admitted. "But perhaps that's how redemption works, transforming rejection into acceptance, isolation into community, greed into grace." We talked until late, processing the day's emotions and planning future support for Grace Haven's expanding mission. Neither of us mentioned Daniel directly, but his absence permeated our conversation like negative space defining a sculpture's form. He'd chosen to make himself dead to us, but that death had paradoxically created new life for dozens of children, who'd faced similar abandonment without his resources or options. As I prepared for bed in the home where our family's drama had unfolded, I reflected on the unexpected journey from betrayal to benediction. Daniel's declaration, "You're dead to me," had seemed like ending when spoken, but proved to be beginning of transformation I couldn't have imagined. His forfeited millions now served purposes he'd despise, but that embodied everything Thomas and I had valued throughout our marriage. The last document I reviewed before sleeping was Grace Haven's latest financial report, showing how carefully managed investments of Daniel's inheritance would provide sustainable funding for generations. Children not yet born would benefit from his rejection, finding homes and education and chosen families through resources he'd valued only for personal accumulation. Turning off the study light, I whispered into darkness, "Thank you, Daniel." Not for his cruelty or rejection, but for inadvertently enabling transformation of individual greed into collective grace. He'd intended to wound with his words and choices, but had instead created opportunities for healing he'd never comprehend from his self-imposed isolation. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in rejection. The most profound legacies emerge from loss, and the truest families form through choice rather than chance. My son had taught me these lessons through negative example, his abandoned inheritance becoming catalyst for connections more valuable than any amount of money could represent. Grace Haven's children would grow up understanding what Daniel had forgotten, that wealth means nothing without willingness to share it, that success requires more than individual achievement, that showing up matters more than showing off. His millions had become their foundation, his rejection their opportunity, his greed their grace. And in that transformation, I found peace that transcended personal loss. Daniel might be dead to our family, but his abandoned inheritance had brought life to dozens of children who'd build chosen families based on values he'd rejected. The irony would be lost on him, but not on those whose lives had been transformed through his unintended generosity. The orphanage had become our family's true legacy, not through biological connection, but through chosen commitment to values that transcend individual ambition. Every child housed, educated, and loved through Daniel's forfeited inheritance represented triumph of community over isolation, compassion over calculation, grace over greed. As sleep finally came, I dreamed not of reconciliation, but of continuation, grace. Haven children growing into adults who understood that inheritance meant more than money, that legacy involved more than personal accumulation, that family required more than genetic connection. They would carry forward values Daniel had rejected, ensuring his abandoned wealth served purposes he'd never appreciate, but that would honor everything Thomas and I had tried to teach. The title of our family's story. My son said, "You're dead." To me, so I donated his inheritance to an orphanage, captured events but not essence. The deeper truth involved transformation of rejection into redemption, of individual loss into collective gain, of one son's cruelty into countless children's opportunities. That was inheritance worth leaving, legacy worth living, family worth choosing. And somewhere in Manhattan, Daniel continued accumulating wealth that would never fill the emptiness his choices had created, while children at Grace Haven built connections that would sustain them through whatever challenges life presented. His rejection had become their foundation, his inheritance their future, his isolation their invitation to create chosen families based on presence rather than presence, values rather than valuations, love rather than lucre. The poetry of this transformation, greed becoming grace through generous redirection of rejected resources, would sustain me through whatever years remained. Daniel had given more through his cruelty than he'd ever have managed through kindness, his abandoned millions creating possibilities he'd never have funded voluntarily. In trying to wound, he'd inadvertently healed. In choosing isolation, he'd unknowingly fostered community. In declaring me dead, he'd brought new life to children who deserved chances his privilege had made him incapable of appreciating. That was his true inheritance, not the millions he'd forfeited, but the transformations they enabled. And while he'd never acknowledge this gift, Grace Haven's children would embody its value through lives built on compassion rather than calculation, connection rather than accumulation, grace rather than greed. Their success would be measured not in portfolios but in relationships, not in net worth but in human worth, not in what they accumulated but in what they contributed. The orphanage lights glowed softly in the distance as Hartford settled into sleep. Somewhere within those walls, children who'd experienced abandonment were discovering that chosen families often provided stronger bonds than biological accidents. They were learning what my son had forgotten, that showing up matters more than showing off, that presence beats presence, that love transcends law. And in that learning, Daniel's cruelest words had become inadvertent blessing. "You're dead to me" had transformed into, "You've given life to us." His rejection had become their reception. His inheritance, donated to an orphanage, had built bridges he'd burned, created families he'd forsaken, fostered values he'd forgotten. The irony was perfect, the justice poetic, the transformation complete. My son had lost his inheritance by declaring me dead, but dozens of children had gained futures by learning to live. His millions had become their foundation. His greed had become their grace. His isolation had become their invitation to connection. And in that beautiful reversal, I found meaning that transcended personal loss. Family wasn't about blood or money or obligation. It was about choosing to show up, choosing to care, choosing to transform individual resources into collective possibilities. Daniel had taught this lesson through negative example, his rejection becoming roadmap for others' redemption. The true inheritance wasn't money, but meaning. Not wealth, but wisdom. Not accumulation, but appreciation for connections that create authentic wealth. Grace Haven's children understood this intuitively, their abandoned backgrounds making them grateful for chosen families that biological privilege had made Daniel incapable of valuing. As Hartford slept, dreams of possibility danced through dormitories funded by forfeited inheritance. Children who'd known rejection were learning acceptance. Youth who'd experienced abandonment were discovering commitment. Kids who'd faced cruelty were finding kindness. All because one son had said, "You're dead to me," and one mother had responded by donating his inheritance to an orphanage. Sometimes the endings we fear become beginnings we need. Sometimes rejection creates redemption. Sometimes loss becomes gain through generous transformation of pain into purpose, cruelty into kindness, greed into grace. That was our family's legacy, not biological continuation, but value transformation. Not personal accumulation, but communal acceleration toward futures bright with chosen connection rather than mere genetic intersection. The orphanage stood as monument to this truth, its walls sheltering children who understood what Daniel had forgotten. That inheritance meant more than money, legacy involved more than personal wealth, and family required more than shared DNA or mutual greed. Their laughter would echo through generations. Their connections would compound through decades. Their values would appreciate through careful cultivation rather than market fluctuation. They were our true heirs, inheriting not millions but meaning, not portfolios but principles, not wealth but wisdom about what made life worth living. Daniel's declaration, "You're dead to me," had become their invitation to life. His forfeited inheritance had become their foundation for futures built on compassion rather than calculation. And in that transformation, our family's story found its perfect ending that was actually beginning, not of biological line, but of chosen connections, not of personal wealth, but of communal worth, not of individual greed, but of collective grace. The orphanage lights glowed steadily through darkness, beacon of hope born from rejection, monument to values that transcend material valuation, testament to truth that real inheritance involves more than money could ever measure. Grace Haven stood where Daniel's greed had fallen, its children rising through resources he'd valued wrongly, their futures bright with possibilities his darkness had inadvertently illuminated. That was inheritance worth leaving, legacy worth living, transformation worth celebrating. My son had said, "You're dead to me." So I donated his inheritance to an orphanage, and in that donation, death became life, rejection became redemption, and greed became grace. Sometimes the most painful endings enable the most beautiful beginnings. Sometimes the greatest losses create the most meaningful gains. Sometimes a son's cruelty becomes catalyst for countless kindnesses. That was our story. Not tragedy, but transformation. Not loss, but gain. Not ending, but beginning of legacies more valuable than any inheritance measured merely in millions. The silence that followed Daniel's departure lasted exactly 3 days before I contacted Martin Rothschild, our family attorney for over 20 years. His office occupied a converted Victorian home on Farmington Avenue, where he'd built his practice serving Hartford's middle-class families with the same dedication that characterized our approach to accounting. When I called requesting an urgent appointment to discuss estate planning changes, his assistant scheduled me immediately, sensing the gravity in my voice. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry to hear about the situation with Daniel," Martin said as I settled into his leather chair, having apparently pieced together the family crisis through Hartford's intricate professional grapevine. "These kinds of rifts are more common than people acknowledge, though that doesn't diminish the pain." I'd brought Thomas's original will, our current financial statements, and preliminary notes I'd drafted during that sleepless night following Daniel's cruel declaration. Martin reviewed the documents methodically, his expression growing increasingly somber as he recognized the magnitude of changes I was proposing. "You're certain about completely disinheriting Daniel?" he asked, his professional obligation requiring this confirmation despite the clarity of my intentions. The courts sometimes overturn emotionally driven estate modifications, especially involving substantial assets. "This isn't emotional," I corrected firmly. "It's philosophical." Daniel explicitly rejected not just me but everything our family represents. He called our values pathetic, our charitable work small-minded, and declared I was dead to him. I'm simply honoring his stated preferences by redirecting resources he'd only value monetarily toward purposes that embody the principles he's rejected. Martin nodded slowly, understanding the deeper implications beyond mere financial redistribution. "And the beneficiary would be Grace Haven Orphanage?" "Exclusively," I confirmed, with specific instructions to establish the True Family Initiative, a program for children abandoned by biological families who prioritized other values. "Daniel's inheritance will serve those who understand what he's forgotten. That family means more than DNA or financial calculations." Over the next 2 hours, we crafted language that would withstand legal challenges while clearly articulating the philosophical foundation for Daniel's disinheritance. Martin suggested including excerpts from Daniel's own words, his dismissal of our charitable work, his declaration that I was dead to him, as evidence this wasn't capricious punishment, but logical consequence of stated positions. "Document everything," Martin advised as we concluded. "Keep records of any communication, save emails or texts. Note witnesses to relevant conversations. If Daniel challenges this, and he might once the financial implications become clear, we'll need evidence that this decision reflects his choices, not your revenge." I appreciated Martin's thoroughness while knowing documentation wasn't necessary for my own clarity. This wasn't about legal protection, but moral alignment. Daniel had chosen values antithetical to our family's century-long tradition of community support. His inheritance would serve communities he'd abandoned, rather than enabling further accumulation by someone who already measured worth through net worth alone. The execution of these changes proceeded methodically over subsequent weeks. Financial. Advisors transferred investment accounts into trust structures benefiting Grace Haven. Real estate attorneys prepared documents that would eventually convey our family home, where Daniel had grown up absorbing values he'd later reject, into foundations supporting homeless families, Each signature felt like affirmation rather than loss, transforming resources into purposes that honored Thomas's memory and our shared principles. Sarah learned about the inheritance changes gradually, her initial surprise evolving into deep understanding as she processed her brother's complete rejection of family values. We met for lunch at the Parkville Market, surrounded by the immigrant, food vendors whose struggles and successes had shaped our neighborhood's character for generations. "I keep thinking about Grandpa Stanislaw," she said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. How he'd react to Daniel's transformation. The cobbler who shared everything with struggling neighbors having great-grandson who sees sharing as weakness. "He'd understand the decision," I replied, remembering stories of my grandfather's fierce loyalty to community over individual advancement. Stanislaw didn't accumulate wealth for its own sake, but as tool for collective support. Daniel's rejection of that philosophy means the wealth should flow to those who still embrace it. Sarah nodded, then surprised me with unexpected revelation. "I've been thinking about my own will lately. Mark and I don't have children yet, but when we do, I want safeguards ensuring our resources serve community regardless of how our kids evolve." Daniel's transformation taught me that values aren't genetic, they're chosen fresh by each generation. This wisdom from my daughter, recognizing that even careful upbringing couldn't guarantee value transmission, reflected maturity born from painful observation of her brother's choices. We discussed establishing perpetual foundations rather than direct inheritance, ensuring resources served community purposes regardless of descendants' individual philosophies. "Maybe that's the lesson," Sarah continued. "We can model values, create environments supporting them, but ultimately each person chooses their own priorities. Our responsibility is ensuring resources we accumulate serve the values we cherish, not just the people we birth." Her insight crystallized thoughts I'd been struggling to articulate. Daniel's rejection had forced recognition that biological connection didn't guarantee philosophical alignment. True legacy lay not in genetic continuation, but in perpetuating principles through institutions and communities that outlasted individual lifespans. The news of Daniel's disinheritance spread through Hartford's professional community despite our attempts at discretion. Reactions varied from sympathy to satisfaction, with several business owners sharing similar stories of children whose values had diverged dramatically from family foundations. These conversations revealed an epidemic of successful parents watching. Children transform generational principles into individual ambition. "My daughter told me charity is just tax-inefficient wealth transfer," confided Robert Chen, whose family had built Hartford's most successful Asian grocery chain through decades of community reciprocity. "Says I should maximize profits instead of supporting struggling suppliers. Where do they learn this coldness?" These informal gatherings evolved into something deeper, a support group for parents mourning children lost not to death, but to values so alien they might as well represent different species. We met monthly, at various members' homes, sharing stories of offspring who'd achieved material success while abandoning principles that created their opportunities. Grace Haven's director, Patricia Williams, approached me about formally establishing the True Family Initiative using Daniel's redirected inheritance. We met in her office, surrounded by children's artwork and photographs, documenting decades of lives transformed through community support. Exactly the kind of inefficient charity Daniel had dismissed as small-minded virtue signaling. "We envision comprehensive programs beyond just housing," Patricia explained, spreading architectural drawings across her desk. "Educational support, psychological counseling, mentorship networks, everything children need when biological families prioritize other values. Your son's rejection, painful as it was, enables us to serve dozens of children facing similar abandonment." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Daniel's millions, accumulated through exactly the Wall Street mechanisms he now worshipped, would fund programs serving populations he'd dismiss as market failures or poor decision-makers. His greed would become grace through transformation he'd never acknowledge, but that honored everything our family had represented across generations. I have one specific request, I added as we reviewed program details. Include financial literacy, education that emphasizes ethical wealth building and community reciprocity. These children need to understand that success isn't measured solely through accumulation, but through contribution. They should learn what Daniel forgot. That individual achievement means nothing without collective advancement. Patricia agreed, enthusiastically, understanding both the practical necessity and symbolic significance of such programming. The True Family Initiative would teach abandoned children not just survival skills, but philosophical frameworks emphasizing connection over collection, service over selfishness, values Daniel had explicitly rejected in declaring me dead to him. Word of the initiative reached Daniel through professional networks he'd cultivated so carefully. According to Marcus, his former college roommate who maintained tentative contact, Daniel's reaction combined rage with remarkable rationalization. He'd apparently convinced himself that I'd manipulated the situation, that his disinheritance represented vindictive punishment for success, rather than logical consequence of his own declarations. He's telling people you cut him off for being too successful, Marcus reported during our coffee meeting, his discomfort with serving as messenger evident in carefully chosen words. Claims you're jealous of his achievements, that you're punishing him for escaping Hartford's limitations. He needs that narrative, I observed, feeling unexpected pity for son who required such elaborate self-deception to avoid confronting his choice's implications. Acknowledging the truth, that he rejected family values before family resources, would challenge the worldview he's adopted. Better to paint himself as victim than admit he's architect of his own disinheritance. Marcus shifted uncomfortably before sharing additional information. He's also suggesting legal action, says emotional decisions about inheritance can be overturned, that he'll contest the will when the time comes. Let him, I replied with calm certainty that surprised even me. He'll have to argue in court that someone who declared me dead to him deserves inheritance from my estate. The philosophical contradiction might prove too much even for his practiced compartmentalization. Indeed, Daniel's threatened legal challenge never materialized beyond angry consultations with attorneys who apparently advised him that his own words, particularly the documented declaration that I was dead to him, would undermine any claim to inheritance based on familial connection. The man who'd built career on strategic calculation had failed to consider how his cruel words might carry financial consequences. As autumn progressed into winter, the True Family Initiative's first phase launched with opening of renovated residential wing at Grace Haven. The dedication ceremony brought together community members whose contributions, financial and voluntary, had transformed Daniel's forfeited inheritance into tangible support for abandoned children. I stood with Patricia as she cut the ribbon, watching children explore spaces designed to feel like homes rather than institutions. These youth, ranging from 8 to 18, had experienced abandonment in various forms, parents choosing addiction over affection, careers over caretaking, new relationships over existing responsibilities. They understood viscerally what Daniel denied intellectually. That family required presence, not just presence. These children will benefit from your son's inheritance in ways he never intended, Patricia whispered during the ceremony. They'll learn that chosen families often provide stronger bonds than biological accidents. One teenager, Marcus, coincidentally sharing the name of Daniel's former roommate, approached me during the reception. His story particularly resonated. Parents, who'd prioritized international consulting careers over child rearing, leaving him with grandparents who'd eventually required care themselves. His intelligence and ambition reminded me painfully of Daniel at that age, but tempered by awareness of abandonment's actual cost. Mrs. Richardson, he said formally, extending his hand with maturity beyond his 16 years. Thank you for making this possible. Patricia told me about your son. how his rejection became our foundation. That's powerful transformation. His articulation, framing painful loss as generative gift, demonstrated wisdom Daniel had never achieved despite superior education and professional success. This young man understood intuitively what my son had forgotten. That individual achievement, without community connection, created hollow success destined for lonely culmination. "Tell me about your plans," I encouraged, genuinely interested in this youth who embodied hopes Daniel had disappointed. "College, definitely," Marcus replied with quiet confidence. "Business major, but focused on social enterprise. I want to build companies that profit while serving communities. Proving market success doesn't require abandoning values." "Maybe that sounds naive." "It sounds revolutionary," I assured him, recognizing in his vision the integration Daniel had failed to achieve, proving that financial success and social responsibility aren't mutually exclusive, but mutually reinforcing. That's the future ethical business needs. Our conversation continued through the reception, this abandoned teenager displaying deeper understanding of value-based success than my Harvard-educated son had ever demonstrated. The irony felt complete. Daniel's rejected inheritance-funding education for youth who grasped naturally what he'd abandoned deliberately. Later that evening, reviewing photographs from the dedication ceremony, I found unexpected peace in the subtle day's revelations. Daniel's cruelty had catalyzed transformation beyond what conventional charity might have accomplished. His millions hadn't just funded programs but created living memorial to values he'd rejected, ensuring dozens of children would understand that family meant choice, not chance. Presence, not presence. Contribution, not mere accumulation. Sarah called as I prepared for bed, having attended the ceremony despite her own busy schedule. "The program's incredible," she said, emotion evident in her voice. "Those kids understand family in ways Daniel never will. His loss, their gain. There's beautiful justice in that transformation." "Justice, yes," I agreed. "But also sadness. Every successful program participant represents the son we lost to greed. Their achievements will always carry echoes of his failure." "Maybe that's appropriate," Sarah suggested gently. "Daniel chose to declare you dead to him. These children are choosing to declare you vital to them. His rejection created their reception. That's not just justice, it's redemption." Her words carried theological weight I hadn't previously considered. Redemption, not for Daniel, who showed no signs of recognizing his choice's implications, but for the values he'd rejected. Every child housed through his forfeited inheritance, every youth educated through redirected resources, every family formed through chosen connection rather than biological accident represented redemptive transformation of individual greed into collective grace. The holiday season approached with its traditional emphasis on family gatherings that now carried different meaning given Daniel's absence. Sarah organized Thanksgiving at her home, inviting extended family plus several Grace Haven youth who lacked elsewhere to celebrate. The guest list embodied our expanded definition of family: biological relatives alongside chosen connections, traditional bonds enriched by intentional relationships. "This feels right," Thomas's brother William observed, watching Grace Haven teenagers help prepare dinner alongside cousins they'd just met. "Your father would approve, family defined by presence rather than pedigree." The meal itself became teaching moment as youth who'd experienced abandonment witnessed functional family dynamics. They observed how we shared labor without keeping score, how conversations included everyone regardless of age or status, how affection was expressed through actions rather than mere words. Several mentioned never having experienced holidays, where everyone was genuinely welcomed rather than merely tolerated. "Is it always like this?" asked Jennifer, a 13-year-old whose parents had chosen mission work over maintaining custody, leaving her with reluctant relatives before entering. "Foster system. The best families make it look effortless," Sarah explained, while teaching her pie crust techniques. But it requires conscious choice. Every person here decided to show up, to contribute, to care. That's what makes us family. Not shared DNA, but shared values. The contrast with Daniel's absence felt particularly acute as we gathered around tables extended through multiple rooms to accommodate everyone. His empty chair represented more than physical absence. It symbolized the hollow space left when family members prioritize individual advancement over collective connection. Yet the space had been filled by youth who understood family's true meaning through its absence, who chose connection despite abandonment's scars. After dinner, as younger children played board games while adults cleaned dishes, Marcus approached with thoughtful question. "Do you ever regret your decision about the inheritance?" I considered carefully before responding. I regret that Daniel's choices made it necessary. But the decision itself? No. Resources should serve values. When people abandon values, they forfeit claim to resources those values generated. "That's what I figured," he said, wisdom beyond his years evident in measured words. "My parents always said money was just tool, but they used it to buy distance from responsibility. You're using it to build bridges. That's the difference." This teenager's clarity exceeded anything Daniel had achieved despite Ivy League education and Wall Street success. Perhaps abandonment taught lessons that privilege obscured. Or maybe some souls possessed innate understanding of human connection's primacy over material accumulation. Either way, conversations like these validated every decision following Daniel's rejection. As winter deepened, the True Family Initiative expanded programming based on residents' needs. Academic tutoring addressed educational gaps created by unstable living situations. Therapy groups helped process abandonment trauma while building resilience. Life skills classes taught everything from budgeting to cooking, preparing youth for independence without replicating patterns that led to their abandonment. "We're not just housing bodies," Patricia explained during board meeting where I now served as major donor representative. "We're nurturing souls who understand family through its absence, who'll create better relationships because they know abandonment's cost." Financial reports showed Daniel's redirected inheritance generating sustainable returns through careful investment, ensuring programs would continue indefinitely. The endowment structure meant Grace Haven could expand services while maintaining quality. Exactly the kind of efficient resource allocation Daniel claimed to value, but had never connected to human outcomes. One snowy evening, while reviewing quarterly reports in my home office, I discovered envelopes slipped under the front door. No postmark or return address, just my name written in handwriting I recognized despite years since seeing it. Inside, a single sheet of expensive stationery contained Daniel's first communication since that devastating night. "Mother, I heard about your donation to Grace Haven. Typical emotional decision disguised as charity. You're giving away resources I earned right to inherit through biological connection. This won't stand legally. Blood matters more than your performative virtue." D. The brief message confirmed he'd learned nothing from our estrangement, still viewing inheritance as earned right rather than conditional gift, still dismissing charity as performative rather than recognizing values-based action. Still prioritizing blood while forgetting he'd declared me dead to him, severing the very connection he now claimed as basis for financial entitlement. I filed the note with other documents Martin had suggested preserving, evidence of Daniel's continued philosophical disconnect from family values. His threat of legal action seemed increasingly hollow, as his own words undermined any claim based on familial bonds he'd explicitly rejected. Sarah read the note during her next visit, shaking, her head at her brother's persistent blindness. He still doesn't understand. Thinks inheritance is about biology rather than values, as if DNA creates entitlement regardless of behavior. He understands what serves his interests, I corrected gently. Daniel's intelligence hasn't diminished. He's simply selective about which realities he acknowledges. Recognizing that his own choices created these consequences would require admitting his value system might be flawed. Easier to blame others than examine himself. Will you respond? What would be the point? He's not seeking reconciliation or understanding, just asserting claim to money he believes belongs to him by birthright. Any response would either encourage false hope of inheritance restoration or provoke escalated conflict. Better to let silence speak. Indeed, Daniel's note went unanswered, joining years of unreciprocated communications in family archives documenting relationships transformed by divergent values. His occasional attempts at contact, always focused on inheritance rather than reconciliation, revealed continued prioritization of wealth over worth, accumulation over connection. Spring arrived with Grace Haven's first graduation ceremony as 3 residents completed high school while living in true family housing. Their academic achievements, remarkable given backgrounds of instability and abandonment, demonstrated resilience that privileged youth like Daniel rarely needed to develop. Each graduate had secured college admission with scholarships supplemented by program funds, ensuring higher education wouldn't require abandoning values for financial survival. "You've given us more than money," valedictorian Angela declared during ceremony attended by hundreds of community supporters. "You've shown us that rejection isn't reflection of our worth, but revelation of others' priorities. We're not abandoned. We're released to find families who choose us as we choose them." Her speech, delivered with poise that belied her 17 years and traumatic history, articulated understanding that had eluded Daniel despite every advantage. These youth recognized family as conscious choice rather than genetic accident, presence rather than pedigree, values rather than valuables. Following the ceremony, Patricia pulled me aside with unexpected news. "We've received inquiry from Documentary, filmmaker interested in profiling the True Family Initiative. She's particularly intrigued by the origin story, how one person's rejection became foundation for accepting abandoned children." "I'm not interested in publicizing family drama," I responded immediately, protective of privacy despite the story's inspirational elements. "Of course," Patricia assured quickly. "We'd focus on the youth and programs, not personal details. But the transformation narrative, resources meant for individual greed becoming collective grace, that's powerful framework for understanding our mission." After consideration, I agreed to limited participation that would highlight program outcomes, rather than family conflict. The resulting documentary, Chosen Families, premiered locally before achieving unexpected national distribution. While carefully avoiding identifying details about Daniel, it captured the essential paradox: how rejection could catalyze redemption when filtered through conscious values. The film's success generated increased donations and volunteer interest, expanding Grace Haven's capacity beyond what Daniel's inheritance alone could have sustained. His unintended legacy grew through compound interest of human connection. Each youth helped becoming advocate for others, creating exponential impact he'd never calculate in his Wall Street algorithms. Marcus, the teenager I'd connected with, at the dedication ceremony, had become unofficial program ambassador. His testimony in the documentary, describing parents who'd prioritized careers over caretaking, resonated with audiences who recognized similar patterns in their own families or communities. His articulate advocacy for chosen families challenged conventional assumptions about biological bonds' primacy. "Blood doesn't guarantee love," he explained during filmed interview. "My biological parents had every advantage, but chose ambition over affection. My Grace Haven family chooses to show up every day despite no genetic obligation. That's real family, people who prioritize presence over profit." The documentary's impact rippled beyond fundraising into cultural conversations about family definition and obligation. Op-ed pieces debated whether biological connection created unconditional entitlement or whether values alignment mattered more than genetic accident. Social media buzzed with stories of chosen families providing support that blood relatives had withheld. Daniel apparently watched the documentary, according to Marcus, the former roommate, who reported another angry phone call about public manipulation, designed to justify theft. His inability to recognize the irony, complaining about theft to someone he'd declared dead, would have been amusing if it weren't so tragic. He's threatening to write rebuttal, Marcus informed me during our quarterly coffee meeting. Says he'll expose the truth about emotional manipulation disguised as charity. Wants to reclaim his narrative. Let him, I responded with equanimity born from certainty. Public examination of his position, that declaring me dead to him doesn't affect inheritance claims, will only highlight the philosophical bankruptcy of his worldview. Truth doesn't require defense, only clear presentation. Daniel's threatened rebuttal never materialized, perhaps because attorneys advised that public statements might undermine future legal challenges, or possibly because articulating his position revealed its inherent contradictions even to him. His silence spoke louder than any argument could have, absence becoming its own form of testimony. As Grace Haven's programs matured, patterns emerged among youth who thrived versus those who struggled. Success correlated not with academic ability or material resources, but with capacity to form authentic connections despite abandonment trauma. Those who embraced chosen family concept flourished, while those who remained bitter about biological rejection often replicated isolation patterns. It's about forgiveness, explained Dr. Sarah Morgan, no relation. During staff training session I observed. Not excusing abandonment, but releasing its power to define identity. Youth who can say their loss, my gain while meaning it, they're the ones who build beautiful chosen families. This insight, that transformation required emotional resolution beyond mere resource provision, shaped program evolution. Therapy components expanded to address forgiveness as practical skill rather than abstract concept. Youth learned to reframe rejection as redirection, abandonment as opportunity for authentic connection with people who actively chose relationship. The second holiday season since Daniel's departure brought unexpected development. His ex-wife Caroline, whom I'd met only briefly during their courthouse wedding, contacted me through Sarah. The divorce had finalized months earlier, but she'd apparently struggled with whether to reach out given the family estrangement. I wanted you to know, she explained during cautious phone conversation, that I understand now why Daniel is who he is. During our marriage, I kept expecting hidden depths, kept believing success had hardened something softer. But there's nothing soft, just calculation all the way down. Her words carried weight of painful recognition I remembered from my own journey toward accepting Daniel's transformation. When did you realize? When my father died last year. Daniel's response focused entirely on inheritance implications and tax strategies. No comfort, no presence, just spreadsheets and estate planning. I realized then, he doesn't feel things the way others do. Values everything through monetary lens. We talked for an hour, two women connected by loving and losing the same man, to greed that consumed human connection. Caroline's experience confirmed patterns I'd observed. Daniel's inability to provide emotional support during crises, his reduction of every situation to financial calculations, his genuine bewilderment when others prioritized presence over profit. The saddest part, Caroline concluded, is that he doesn't know what he's missing, thinks everyone secretly shares his priorities but pretends otherwise for social convenience. Can't conceive that people genuinely value connection over accumulation. Her insight explained much about Daniel's persistent conviction that inheritance was stolen, despite his explicit rejection of family bonds. In his worldview, blood relationships existed primarily as financial pipelines, channels for resource transfer rather than emotional connection. Declaring me dead severed emotional ties he'd never valued while expecting financial links to remain intact. This compartmentalization, separating relationship components to retain benefits while discarding obligations, revealed fundamental, Misunderstanding of how authentic families functioned. Real relationships integrated multiple dimensions that couldn't be selectively maintained. Rejecting someone's values while expecting their valuables demonstrated the transactional thinking that had replaced genuine connection in Daniel's life. As spring returned, Grace Haven celebrated 5-year anniversary of the True Family Initiative. Statistical outcomes exceeded projections. 90% of program participants had graduated high school, 70% were attending college, and most importantly, nearly all had formed lasting relationships with mentors and peers that constituted chosen families. The anniversary gala featured testimonials from youth whose lives had been transformed through Daniel's redirected inheritance. Speaker after speaker described finding family among others who understood abandonment's pain and choosing connection despite its risks. Their stories created living testament to values Daniel had rejected. Proof that showing up mattered more than showing off, that presence beat presence, that love transcended law. "You gave us more than housing or education," Marcus explained. In keynote address, now college sophomore studying social entrepreneurship. "You demonstrated that rejection isn't permanent verdict, but temporary redirection toward people who recognize our worth. Every success story here represents triumph of chosen connection over biological accident." The standing ovation that followed felt like collective affirmation of principles our family had cherished across generations. These young adults, abandoned by biological families, but embraced by chosen ones, embodied everything Stanislaw Kowalski had understood arriving with $14 and determination to build supportive community. Daniel remained absent from such celebrations, his street career apparently consuming all available time and emotional energy. Mutual acquaintances reported increasing professional success, accompanied by deepening personal isolation. His second marriage to another investment banker lasted less than a year, ending with prenuptial agreements that prevented financial entanglement. Perfect. Expression of relationships reduced to contractual arrangements. "He's becoming caricature of himself," Marcus, the roommate, observed during final coffee meeting before relocating to London. "Works 100-hour weeks accumulating wealth he never enjoys, maintains relationships only for networking value, measures everything through return on investment. It's tragic, really. Yet tragedy requires recognition of loss, awareness of alternatives foregone." Daniel seemed genuinely satisfied with choices that horrified others, convinced that financial success validated philosophical framework that reduced human connection to cost-benefit analysis. His inability to perceive what he'd sacrificed for success created impenetrable armor against regret or reconsideration. The legal challenge he'd threatened eventually materialized as I approached 74th birthday. Process servers delivered papers contesting my estate plans based on undue influence and emotional decision-making following family conflict. The filing revealed Daniel's continued conviction that inheritance represented birthright rather than conditional gift dependent on shared values. Martin handled the response with characteristic thoroughness, compiling evidence that my decisions reflected long-standing philosophical positions rather than emotional reaction to specific incident. The True Family Initiative's success provided compelling demonstration that resources were being stewarded according to principles Daniel had explicitly rejected, not squandered through vengeful impulse. His own words condemn his position, Martin I explained while reviewing our response. "Declaring you dead to him, while claiming inheritance rights based on biological connection, creates irreconcilable contradiction. No court will ignore that fundamental inconsistency." Indeed, preliminary hearings suggested judges found Daniel's position philosophically untenable. His attorneys struggled to explain how someone could sever familial bonds while maintaining financial claims based on those same connections. The case proceeded slowly through system, generating legal precedents about values-based inheritance that would influence estate planning beyond our family drama. During this period, Grace Haven announced expansion to second campus in Bridgeport. serving coastal Connecticut's abandoned youth. The new facility, funded through investment returns from Daniel's redirected inheritance, would replicate True Family Initiative's successful model while adapting to local community needs. His millions continued multiplying through service rather than selfishness, compound interest of compassion exceeding any returns his Wall Street calculations could generate. Sarah and I attended groundbreaking ceremony where youth from Hartford campus performed songs they'd composed about chosen families and second chances. Their voices, strengthened through surviving abandonment, carried across gathered crowd with power that polished professional performances couldn't match. Authenticity born from lived experience rather than rehearsed emotion. Daniel's greatest gift, Sarah whispered during particularly moving musical number, was removing himself from our lives completely. Imagine if he'd maintained minimal contact, enough to preserve inheritance claims but not enough for genuine relationship. This clean break, painful as it was, enabled transformation that partial estrangement would have prevented. Her observation contained profound truth I hadn't previously considered. Daniel's absolute rejection, declaring me dead rather than merely distant, had created clarity that enabled decisive action. Partial estrangement might have prolonged hope for reconciliation, preventing the inheritance redirection that now served hundreds of abandoned youth. His cruelty had paradoxically enabled kindness to flourish through channels he'd never intended. The documentary filmmaker returned for follow-up project, examining long-term outcomes from True Family Initiative. This sequel, Chosen Families, 5 years later, would track original participants' progress while introducing new residents whose stories reflected evolving patterns of family abandonment. Technology executives prioritizing IPOs over infants, social media influencers choosing followers over family, cryptocurrency millionaires measuring worth through digital assets rather than human connection, modern variations on ancient theme of valuing accumulation over relationship. The particulars change, but patterns remain, the filmmaker observed during production meeting. Parents abandon children for whatever their generation defines as success: land, gold, stocks, bitcoins. Your story resonates because it reveals timeless truth. Authentic wealth lies in connection, not collection. Her project would eventually win awards for exploring how individual rejection could catalyze collective redemption when filtered through conscious values. Daniel's unwitting contribution to social dialogue about family, values, and inheritance created legacy he'd never acknowledge, but that influenced countless lives beyond Grace Haven's direct reach. As my 75th birthday approached, I reflected on journey from that devastating night when Daniel declared me dead to current reality, where his rejection had birthed new life for abandoned children throughout Connecticut. The transformation felt miraculous yet logical, natural consequence of aligning resources with values rather than allowing biological accident to determine distribution. Sarah organized modest celebration at Grace Haven's original campus, inviting residents alongside traditional family and longtime friends. The gathering embodied our expanded definition of kinship: genetic relatives enriched by chosen relationships, biological bonds strengthened through intentional connection. Daniel's absence no longer felt like loss but completion, puzzle piece whose removal allowed beautiful picture to emerge. During dinner, Patricia announced establishment of Eleanor Richardson Scholarship Fund, created through donated appreciation, from program graduates who'd achieved professional success while maintaining community values. These young adults, many now working in social enterprises that balanced profit with purpose, wanted to ensure future abandoned youth could access education without compromising principles. You showed us that inheritance isn't about money but meaning, explained Angela, the valedictorian now completing social work degree. We're passing forward what you invested in us, not just financial resources but philosophical framework that transforms rejection into redemption. Their gift represented validation beyond any inheritance Daniel might have provided. These chosen children understood and implemented values he'd rejected, creating sustainable cycles of support that would outlast individual lifespans. Every scholarship recipient would carry forward principles our family had cherished across generations, proof that values traveled through vessels that chose to hold them, not those claiming entitlement while scorning contents. The legal challenge concluded anticlimactically with summary judgment in our favor. Courts found Daniel's position, severing emotional bonds while maintaining financial claims, legally untenable and philosophically incoherent. The ruling established precedent that inheritance rights depended on relationship recognition, not mere biological connection. Declaring someone dead to you carried consequences beyond emotional estrangement into practical forfeiture of financial benefits, dependent on acknowledged kinship. Martin called with news while I was reviewing Grace Haven's annual report showing expanding impact from programs funded through Daniel's forfeited inheritance. Complete victory, he announced with satisfaction. The judge's opinion specifically cites Daniel's declaration that you were dead to him, as invalidating any inheritance claims based on familial relationship. He can't have it both ways, rejecting family while expecting family resources. Send him copy of the ruling, I requested after moments' consideration. Not from vindictiveness, but for clarity. He should understand that choices carry consequences, that words have weight beyond immediate emotional impact. Whether Daniel read the judgment or dismissed it as further manipulation remained unknown. He maintained complete silence following legal defeat, perhaps finally understanding that his philosophical framework provided no grounds for challenging values-based inheritance decisions. His Wall Street training in accepting losses and moving forward apparently extended to family matters once financial implications became irreversible. Life continued with rhythms established through conscious choice rather than default patterns. I maintained part-time consulting at the accounting firm, finding purpose in helping small businesses navigate financial challenges while maintaining ethical principles. Sarah's counseling practice flourished as word spread about her expertise in family estrangement. Painful personal experience transformed into professional insight, helping others navigate similar losses. Grace Haven evolved beyond initial mission, as True Family Initiative graduates returned as mentors, staff members, and donors. The cyclical nature of support, abandoned children becoming advocates for next generation, created sustainable community that transcended individual involvement. Daniel's inheritance hadn't just funded programs, but seeded self-perpetuating cycles of compassion that would outlast any single benefactor. One autumn afternoon, while walking through Hartford's Bushnell Park where Thomas and I had courted decades earlier, I encountered unexpected reminder of roads not taken. A young man resembling Daniel, same determined jawline, similar purposeful stride, helped elderly woman gather scattered groceries after her bag had torn. His gentle assistance, provided without hesitation or expectation of reward, demonstrated values my actual son had abandoned for individual advancement. "Thank you, dear," the woman said, patting his arm with grandmotherly affection. "Your parents raised you right." "Just doing what anyone would do," he replied with genuine modesty that revealed good character as clearly as Daniel's calculating nature had exposed corrupted values. Watching this stranger embody principles my son had rejected, I felt final release of lingering hope for Daniel's transformation. Some people chose compassion despite advantages that enabled selfishness. Others chose greed despite upbringing emphasizing connection. The young man helping gather scattered oranges represented who Daniel might have been with different choices. Reminder that values weren't inevitable but selected fresh daily through countless small decisions. Winter arrived with news that Marcus, the Grace Haven graduate studying social entrepreneurship, had launched his first venture, affordable housing cooperative, that provided sliding-scale rents based on residents' ability to pay. His business model balanced financial sustainability with social mission. The legal challenge concluded anticlimactically with summary judgment in our favor. Courts found Daniel's position, severing emotional bonds while maintaining financial claims, legally untenable and philosophically incoherent. The ruling established precedent that inheritance rights depended on relationship recognition, not mere biological connection. Declaring someone dead to you carried consequences beyond emotional estrangement into practical forfeiture of financial benefits, dependent on acknowledged kinship. Martin called with news while I was reviewing Grace Haven's annual report showing expanding impact from programs funded through Daniel's forfeited inheritance. Complete victory, he announced with satisfaction. The judge's opinion specifically cites Daniel's declaration that you were dead to him as invalidating any inheritance claims based on familial relationship. He can't have it both ways, rejecting family while expecting family resources. Send him copy of the ruling, I requested after moments' consideration. Not from vindictiveness, but for clarity. He should understand that choices carry consequences, that words have weight beyond immediate emotional impact. Whether Daniel read the judgment or dismissed it as further manipulation remained unknown. He maintained complete silence following legal defeat, perhaps finally understanding that his philosophical framework provided no grounds for challenging values-based inheritance decisions. His Wall Street training in accepting losses and moving forward apparently extended to family matters once financial implications became irreversible. Life continued with rhythms established through conscious choice rather than default patterns. I maintained part-time consulting at the accounting firm, finding purpose in helping small businesses navigate financial challenges while maintaining ethical principles. Sarah's counseling practice flourished as word spread about her expertise in family estrangement. Painful personal experience transformed into professional insight, helping others navigate similar losses. Grace Haven evolved beyond initial mission, as True Family Initiative graduates returned as mentors, staff members, and donors. The cyclical nature of support, abandoned children becoming advocates for next generation, created sustainable community that transcended individual involvement. Daniel's inheritance hadn't just funded programs, but seeded self-perpetuating cycles of compassion that would outlast any single benefactor. One autumn afternoon, while walking through Hartford's Bushnell Park where Thomas and I had courted decades earlier, I encountered unexpected reminder of roads not taken. A young man resembling Daniel, same determined jawline, similar purposeful stride, helped elderly woman gather scattered groceries after her bag had torn. His gentle assistance, provided without hesitation or expectation of reward, demonstrated values my actual son had abandoned for individual advancement. "Thank you, dear," the woman said, patting his arm with grandmotherly affection. "Your parents raised you right." "Just doing what anyone would do," he replied with genuine modesty that revealed good character as clearly as Daniel's calculating nature had exposed corrupted values. Watching this stranger embody principles my son had rejected, I felt final release of lingering hope for Daniel's transformation. Some people chose compassion despite advantages that enabled selfishness. Others chose greed despite upbringing emphasizing connection. The young man helping gather scattered oranges represented who Daniel might have been with different choices. Reminder that values weren't inevitable but selected fresh daily through countless small decisions. Winter arrived with news that Marcus, the Grace Haven graduate studying social entrepreneurship, had launched his first venture, affordable housing cooperative, that provided sliding-scale rents based on residents' ability to pay. His business model balanced financial sustainability with social mission, proving Daniel wrong about market solutions and community support being mutually exclusive. "You inspired this," Marcus explained during video call from his Boston office, showing that resources could serve values rather than just accumulate. "My company proves profit and purpose can coexist, something your son never understood despite all his financial expertise." The irony felt complete. Daniel's rejected inheritance had educated young entrepreneur who achieved integration of capitalism and compassion that Harvard-trained son had declared impossible. Every successful social enterprise launched by Grace Haven graduates demonstrated false dichotomy between financial success and community service, proof that Daniel's either-or framework reflected limited imagination rather than economic reality. As I approached my 76th birthday, health remained stable despite natural aging's accumulation of minor challenges. Regular checkups revealed no serious concerns, though I'd begun simplifying life in preparation for whatever years remained. The house where we'd raised children and hosted countless community gatherings felt unnecessarily large for one person, its rooms echoing with memories both joyful and painful. "I'm thinking about downsizing," I mentioned to Sarah during weekly lunch at Parkville Market. "Maybe a nice apartment near the park, somewhere I can walk to everything I need. The house should serve a family again, not just store one person's memories." Sarah's eyes misted slightly, understanding the deeper implications. "You're thinking about turning it into transitional housing for Grace Haven families, aren't you?" The irony would be complete, I admitted. Daniel grew up in that house absorbing values he later rejected. Now it could shelter families who understand. Meanwhile, the first families moved into what neighbors had begun calling Richardson House, not from formal designation, but organic recognition of continuing family legacy despite biological disconnection. These carefully selected households, each, including Grace Haven graduates establishing independent lives, understood they were inheriting more than free housing. "This isn't just a dwelling," Patricia explained during orientation. "It's living classroom about how families function when love takes precedence over law, presence over pedigree. You're learning to create what Daniel Richardson forgot, that home happens through showing up, not just sharing DNA." The house thrived under its new purpose, walls that had witnessed one son's rejection of family values now sheltering multiple families committed to mutual support. Garden plots Thomas had tended became communal growing spaces where residents shared both labor and harvest. The basement workshop where Daniel had learned, then forgotten, about helping others repair bicycles returned to its original function as neighbors fixed things together while fixing themselves. Dr. Morgan's psychological assessments showed remarkable outcomes for families transitioning through Richardson House. Children who'd experienced abandonment began trusting again in stable environment where multiple adults demonstrated consistent care. Parents who'd aged out of foster system learned family dynamics they'd never experienced firsthand. Grace Haven's investment in transitional housing, funded through Daniel's forfeited inheritance, generated returns measurable in healed relationships rather than financial statements. "The house itself seems therapeutic," Dr. Morgan observed during team meeting. "As if positive energy accumulated through decades of family life provides foundation for new families building on consciously chosen values." I'm not usually mystical, but there's something special about that space. Her observation resonated with reports from residents who described feeling held by the house in ways that transcended physical shelter. Perhaps spaces absorbed intentions of those who inhabited them, walls remembering love even when individuals forgot. If so, Daniel's childhood home offered perfect correction to his adult choices, physical structure he'd rejected, continuing family mission he'd abandoned. The second documentary filmmaker had followed Richardson House transformation for her sequel, capturing powerful moments as new families created traditions in spaces where our family's traditions had originated. One scene, showing Grace Haven youth decorating Christmas tree in the same corner where Daniel had once helped place ornaments, provided visual metaphor for redemption through replacement that no scripted moment could have equaled. "Your stories become bigger than personal family drama," she explained during final interview. "It represents philosophical choice every generation faces, individual advancement versus collective support. Daniel chose one path. These families choose another. The house stands as monument to that choice." Her completed film earned film festival acclaim before streaming platform distribution introduced worldwide audiences to Grace Haven's model of transforming family abandonment into communal connection. International inquiries arrived weekly from organizations seeking to replicate True Family Initiative's approach, spreading ripple effects of Daniel's rejected inheritance across continents. Marcus graduated with dual degrees in business and social work, immediately joining Grace Haven's board while launching Second Social Enterprise, meal delivery service employing program graduates while serving elderly residents in food deserts. His integration of profit with purpose demonstrated sustainable alternatives to Daniel's zero-sum thinking about financial success, requiring abandoned values. "Every successful business I create proves your son wrong," Marcus told me during board meeting where he presented expansion plans. He believed market mechanisms inevitably reward selfishness. "I'm building companies that reward compassion while remaining financially viable." His inheritance didn't just fund charity, it's seeding entire economic ecosystem based on mutual support. This multiplication effect, resources originally accumulated through traditional capitalism being transformed into social capital, generating both financial and humanitarian returns, represented ultimate refutation of Daniel's worldview. His millions hadn't disappeared into inefficient charity, but catalyzed innovative approaches to combining individual success with collective advancement. Spring brought unexpected communication that initially seemed like another legal maneuver. The letter arrived through Daniel's attorneys but contained personal message rather than litigation threat. "Mother, I've been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. Doctors give me 6 months to a year. I'm not seeking reconciliation or inheritance reversal. Just thought you should know. Daniel." The clinical tone, conveying devastating news with emotional detachment that characterized all his recent communications, triggered complex response. Maternal instinct urged immediate contact, offering support despite years of rejection. Yet experience counseled caution, recognizing potential manipulation even in extremis. "What do you want to do?" Sarah asked after I'd shared the news. Her professional training evident in neutral questioning that avoided pushing particular response. "I need to think," I replied honestly. His declaration that I was dead to him presumably included situations like this. Does terminal diagnosis invalidate his choice to sever family bonds? Or would responding simply enable further emotional manipulation? Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Whatever you decide, make it for your own closure rather than his benefit. He made his choices. You're not obligated to ignore them because circumstances changed." Her wisdom reflected hard-learned lessons from counseling families navigating estrangement. Death didn't automatically repair relationships severed by living choices. Daniel's diagnosis, tragic as it was, didn't erase years of rejection or transform his values. Response required careful consideration of what would serve my own peace rather than his potential agenda. After days of reflection, I chose middle path, acknowledgement without engagement. My reply, sent through attorneys to maintain boundaries he'd established, read simply, "I'm sorry to hear about your diagnosis. I hope you find peace. Your mother." No offers of reconciliation he hadn't sought. No reopening of doors he'd slammed. No pretense that terminal illness erased history of cruel rejection and calculated attempts to claim inheritance while disowning family. Just human acknowledgement of human suffering, maintaining dignity for both of us. Daniel didn't respond directly, though his attorneys confirmed receipt. Updates came through Hartford's professional network. He'd taken medical leave from the firm, moved from Manhattan penthouse to treatment facility in Westchester, endured aggressive chemotherapy with characteristic determination to defeat anything, threatening his control. "He's fighting it like hostile takeover," Marcus, the former roommate, reported during what would be our last meeting. "Analyzing survival statistics, researching experimental treatments, basically approaching cancer like market inefficiency to be exploited. Very Daniel. Even dying becomes competitive achievement to master." Yet disease progression ignored his strategic planning. Within 3 months, Updates indicated transition from active treatment to palliative care. The man who'd built career on calculating outcomes faced ultimate uncertainty with apparent bewilderment that careful planning couldn't guarantee desired results. Sarah visited him once, despite my caution about emotional manipulation. She returned visibly shaken, not from his physical deterioration, but from his persistent philosophical rigidity even when confronting mortality. He spent the entire visit discussing estate distribution to maximize tax benefits, she reported. No reflection on relationships or meaning, just concern about IRS implications. When I mentioned Gracehaven's success with his inheritance, he called it suboptimal resource allocation and suggested I was partially responsible for enabling your emotional decision-making. Her experience confirmed that terminal diagnosis hadn't prompted spiritual transformation. Daniel approached death as he'd approached life, through lens of financial optimization rather than human connection. His values remained consistent even when facing ultimate transition where accumulated wealth meant nothing. Caroline contacted me again as Daniel's condition worsened, sharing her own attempt at closure. I visited last week, thought maybe facing death would crack that shell of calculation, but he spent 40 minutes explaining how I should structure my retirement accounts. Even dying, he can only relate through financial advice. These reports reinforced my decision to maintain boundaries. Deathbed reconciliations made satisfying stories, but required mutual willingness that Daniel hadn't demonstrated. His terminal condition was tragic, but tragedy didn't automatically generate redemption. Some people died as they lived, holding tightly to chosen values regardless of consequence. Daniel passed on a Tuesday morning in early April, according to notification from his attorneys. The brief message indicated he'd died peacefully at hospice facility. Though I wondered what peace looked like for someone who'd measured everything through acquisition rather than connection. His final instructions requested cremation with no memorial service, perhaps fitting end for someone who'd declared family bonds defunct while living. The will reading, which Sarah and I attended from mixture of closure-seeking and curiosity rather than financial interest, revealed Daniel's final consistency. His accumulated wealth, exceeding even our estimates despite market volatility, was distributed with mathematical precision among former colleagues and strategic contacts who might benefit his professional legacy. No acknowledgement of family beyond perfunctory legal requirements, no charitable bequests, no indication that approaching death had altered his conviction that worth equaled net worth. He died as he lived, Martin observed quietly after other beneficiaries departed with their windfalls, completely transactional to the end. Yet even Daniel's death generated unexpected transformations. Several beneficiaries, apparently moved by the stark contrast between inherited wealth and Daniel's isolated passing, contacted Gracehaven about establishing memorial funds. His former assistant endowed scholarships specifically for youth interested in business, but ethical business, she emphasized, the kind that builds community rather than destroying it for profit. These spontaneous gestures suggested Daniel's negative example inspired positive responses, even posthumously. People who'd witnessed his calculated existence chose different paths when confronted with its ultimate emptiness. His death became teaching moment about costs of prioritizing accumulation over connection, lesson he'd never internalized, but others absorbed through observing his isolation. At Sarah's suggestion, we held private memorial at Elizabeth Park rather than formal funeral. Just immediate family. Sarah, myself, and several Gracehaven youth who'd become extended family through chosen connection rather than biological accident. We shared memories of early Daniel, the curious child who'd helped neighbors, the teenager who'd organized fundraisers, the young man who'd promised to use success for community benefit. He was loved, I said finally, surprising myself with present tense that felt more accurate than past. Despite everything, that love persists. His rejection of it doesn't diminish its existence. Marcus spoke next, offering perspective from abandoned child who'd found family through Daniel's forfeited inheritance. His choices gave us chances. His rejection became our reception. Maybe that's how love works sometimes, transforming through unexpected channels when direct paths close. We scattered no ashes. Daniel's cremains were interred in Manhattan Cemetery he'd designated, far from family plots in Hartford. But we planted dogwood tree in the park where his grandparents had walked, where his parents had courted, where his children had played before values diverged beyond reconciliation. Living memorial for love that persisted despite rejection, for family bonds that outlasted individual defection. The tree would grow through seasons, roots deepening while branches reached skyward, natural metaphor for how Daniel's rejection had paradoxically strengthened family values through clarifying their importance. Every spring would bring blossoms, every summer shade, every autumn color, beauty emerging from painful pruning, new growth enabled by old woods removal. Returning home, to my comfortable apartment rather than the family house now sheltering, chosen families. I reflected on journey from that terrible night when Daniel declared me dead to this moment of complex peace. His cruelty had catalyzed transformations he'd never value, but that honored everything our family represented across generations. Grace Haven thrived through his inheritance. Richardson House provided stability for families building on consciously chosen values. Hundreds of abandoned youth had discovered that chosen families often proved stronger than biological accidents. Social enterprises demonstrated false dichotomy between profit and purpose. Documentary films spread philosophical questions about family meaning to audiences worldwide, all because one son said, "You're dead to me." And one mother responded by ensuring his inheritance served those who understood what he'd forgotten. That showing up matters more than showing off. Presence beats presence. Love transcends law. And family requires choice rather than chance. The final irony arrived 6 months after Daniel's death, when forensic accountants settling his complex estate discovered something remarkable. Despite his strategic brilliance and calculated approaches, Daniel had died with less wealth than his projected inheritance would have provided. Market volatility, costly divorces, and lifestyle inflation had eroded fortune he'd accumulated at such personal cost. He would have been wealthier keeping family connections, the accountant observed with professional detachment. Your steady investment approach with Grace Haven has outperformed his aggressive strategies. The inheritance he forfeited has grown more than estate he built rejecting it. Numbers validated what values had already proven: community investment. Generated better returns than individual accumulation. Relationships appreciated more reliably than portfolios. Compound interest of compassion exceeded any derivative Daniel's algorithms had calculated. His rejection of family support hadn't just cost him emotionally but financially, though he'd died without recognizing this ultimate market inefficiency. Sarah laughed when I shared this discovery, finding cosmic justice in mathematical proof that Daniel's philosophy had failed even by its own metrics. He spent life optimizing for wealth while destroying what creates real prosperity. Even the market eventually punishes pure selfishness. But I felt only sadness for son who'd missed life's most valuable investments while chasing returns that ultimately disappointed. His story became cautionary tale, not through melodrama, but through accounting, spreadsheets revealing spiritual bankruptcy that no amount of material accumulation could offset. As seasons turned and life continued, Daniel's absence evolved from acute wound to chronic ache to philosophical acceptance. Grace Haven's work expanded through sustainable endowments his inheritance had enabled. Richardson House fostered new families in spaces where our family had fractured. Documentary films inspired global conversations about chosen families and value-based inheritance. Occasionally, in quiet moments, I wondered about alternate timelines. Universes where Daniel had made different choices, where family dinners included his presence, where grandchildren might have carried forward names and values across generations. But such speculation proved futile against actual reality, where his rejection had enabled redemptions he'd never comprehend. My epitaph was already written through lives transformed by his forfeited inheritance. When my time came, hopefully years hence but inevitably approaching, the legacy wouldn't be measured in dollars accumulated, but connections fostered, not in wealth preserved, but values transmitted, not in biological continuation, but philosophical propagation through chosen heirs who understood what Daniel had forgotten. The Richardson family story wouldn't end with one son's defection, but continue through hundreds of youth who learned that family meant showing up, that wealth meant sharing, that success meant serving, that connection mattered more than collection. They carried forward what Daniel had dropped, ensuring values traveled through vessels that chose to hold them rather than those claiming entitlement while scorning contents. On peaceful evenings in my apartment overlooking the park, I sometimes saw families walking paths where Thomas and I had pushed baby carriages, where children had learned to bicycle, where teenage Daniel had promised to use future success for community benefit. These strangers unknowingly traced roots through our history, their own stories intersecting with ours in ways they'd never recognize. "You're dead to me," Daniel had declared with vicious finality that devastating night. "Your loss has become our gain." Hundreds of abandoned youth now responded through lives built on values he'd rejected. His inheritance, donated to orphanage serving children whose biological families had failed them, created more family connections than he'd ever maintained. His millions multiplied through community investment rather than market manipulation. His legacy lived through those who understood what he'd forgotten, who chose presence over profits, who built bridges where he'd burned them. The mathematics of redemption calculated differently than Wall Street algorithms. Daniel had optimized for individual accumulation and achieved isolation. Grace Haven optimized for collective connection and achieved abundance. The ledger balanced perfectly, resources flowing from those who hoarded toward those who shared, creating equilibrium between values and valuables that honored both without confusing their relative worth. In the end, Daniel's story became parenthetical to larger narrative of family values persisting through conscious choice rather than genetic default. His rejection had clarified importance of intentional community. His absence had highlighted significance of presence. His greed had illuminated grace, operating through generous transformation of resources from individual ambition to collective support. Sitting in evening light as Hartford settled into spring dusk, I felt profound gratitude for a journey that began with devastating rejection, but evolved into widespread redemption. Daniel's choices had caused immense pain while inadvertently enabling immeasurable good. His declaration that I was dead to him had birthed new life for countless others who learned that family transcended biology, that inheritance involved more than money, that showing up mattered more than showing off.